Chapter 11:17 The strongest organization. As the flames flickered, Derek and company subconsciously looked at the long dark red table. The first thing they noticed was the figure closest to them. The figure wore a simple linen robe, and had a head of long silver hair and indiscernible facial features. It made Colin, Wuxia, and Derek find the figure oddly familiar. In an instant, they felt as though a bolt of lightning struck their minds, illuminating their blurry memories. Angel of Fate, Ouroboros. Read more chapters at allnovelful.com. Just as the pupils of the team from the City of Silver dilated, the figure turned around and looked at them. A pair of indifferent eyes immediately occupied their vision as extraordinary mysterious rings appeared. In a daze, Derek saw a figure in front of him. He was a handsome, radiant, and energetic man. He wore a pure white robe and had short golden hair. With his appearance, the surroundings became abnormally bright. The warm feeling was like a ray of light, instantly filling every spot. Derek felt as though he had seen the day, as mentioned in legends, momentarily forgetting where he was or what he was doing. The man took a step forward and his blurry figure overlapped with Derek. Then, Derek sat beside the dark red long table, occupying one of the high-back chairs. He had become the handsome and radiant man who was attending a secret gathering. At the same time, the grizzled City of Silver chief, Colin, whose face was covered in old scars, encountered the same blurry and illusory figure. The figure was 7 to 8 meters tall. He was wearing silver full-body armor, and his eyes were glowing like the light of dawn. He raised the long sword in his hand, letting it press against Colin Iliad's forehead like a scepter. Demon Hunter Colin struggled for a moment, but he quickly calmed down when he was enveloped by the orange light. With that, he and the giant in front of him merged into one. He strode towards the dark red table and sat on the second seat on the right. Shepherd Wuxia encountered a man in a long black robe. He had black curly hair over his shoulders and a pair of eyes that seemed to be covered in shadows. It was difficult to see his face clearly, but the silver threads, complicated patterns, and gorgeous accessories were directly reflected in her mind. Wuxia trembled and couldn't help but lower her head, allowing the layers of black wings on the man's back to wrap around her. She became the man and walked to the end of the dark red table. There were 2 high-back chairs with complex patterns placed there. Wuxia chose the left one. The remaining members of the City of Silver's expedition team also encountered similar situations, but the figures they faced were different. After they found their seats on both sides of the dark red table, the area around the empty high-back chair at the seat of honor became darker, outlining a female figure that seemed to be shrouded in fog. Right on the heels of that, a voice that seemed to transmigrate from ancient times echoed in the ears of the attendees. We are trying to redeem ourselves, and also maintain the balance of this world. Dissociation and deviation are undoubtedly the most basic order. This is also in line with his thoughts. I can't deny that we all have our own sinister thoughts and desires, but this is very normal. Death and spilling blood are inevitable. In the name of Rose redemption, above the gray fog, Klein listened attentively. He couldn't wait to hear more of the content said by the voice. However, whether it was the scene or the voice, it began to loop. It was as if it had only been fixed at a section lasting less than a minute. This is the scene of the establishment of the Rose redemption. Previously, the Red Angel evil spirit said that this was an extremely secretive organization established by a group of corrupted angels. Now, it seems like that isn't the case. The person who said that was probably not Medici, but either Sauron and Einhorn. They actually didn't know much about Rose redemption. Klein mumbled inwardly as he cast his gaze back at the City of Silver team that were repeating the actions like puppets, approaching the table, sitting down, listening, and leaving. When the torches around the hall lit up one after another, Klein had already found something unusual with his true vision. He saw the murals on the wall come alive and rapidly expand, overlapping with the hall. It made the table, chairs, and floor tiles that had been cold for thousands of years warm up once again. It made the figures that had once been in this secret meeting cross the borders of time, reviving, at their fixed seats, allowing the words from the past to reappear. Many of those figures were familiar to Klein. One of them was the Angel of Fate Ouroboros. This king of angels, who was still a member of the Rose Redemption, was the most lifelike among all the illusory figures. Combined with how the scenes were looping, Klein began to suspect the person who left the murals was Tail Devourer Ouroboros. In the previous temple ruins, there were murals left behind by him, likewise for the ruins of the Battle of the Gods. In the Giant King's court, there are similar murals and signs of those powers. I wouldn't believe it if anyone were to say it's not him. Just how much does this king of angels like murals? He draws them wherever he goes. Klein couldn't help but lampoon Ouroboros in his mind. The second figure he noticed was sitting beside the Angel of Fate Ouroboros. He was dressed in black armor that seemed to be splashed with blood. He had red hair that resembled fire, looking young and handsome. The reason why he paid attention to this figure was because he had seen it in his dreams. In addition, it was also the most arrogant person among all the figures. Not only did it sit back in its chair, but it also placed its feet on the dark red long table. It didn't mind that the surrounding people were high-level figures of the same status. Red Angel, Medici. These are the kings of angels who participated in the secret gathering? Who else is involved? As Klein's thoughts raced, he decided to first rescue the people from the City of Silver who couldn't exit the looping cycles of fate. He had a lot of experience in this aspect. Yes, the medium to the loop is the hall itself. However, there's no need to attempt to destroy it. As long as it can temporarily break the cycle of fate, the dusk outside will seep in and dispel any abnormalities. They belong to the divine kingdom itself. In terms of status, they can only be stronger or on par with the power left behind by Ouroboros. After observing for a few seconds, Klein quickly came to a conclusion. After flipping a gold coin for a divination, he immediately spread his spirituality towards the crimson star representing the sun. Derek Berg's spirit body immediately tore through the cycle of fate, creating an invisible crack. The orange glow from the light of dusk outside the palace immediately surged into the hall from the window up high. Without waiting for Little Sun to figure out his situation, for fear that the true creator would lock onto him, Klein didn't hesitate to let him return to the real world. Derek snapped out of his daze and realized that he had unknowingly sat down at the side of the dark red table. He looked up blankly and saw the chief, Elder Lovia, Hyam, Antiona, and the others. He realized that there were still certain traces of confusion on their faces. Thinking back to his experience just now, Derek was alert as he deliberated and said, "The cycle of fate, indeed." Colin Iliad, who had experienced this before, nodded slightly and stood up. He looked around, and his gaze landed on the largest mural that he had seen lately. The mural depicted the same exact hall. There were similar columns, torches, the dark red table, complicated high-back chairs, and object layout. As for those high-back chairs, there were 11 figures sitting in them. At the very end were 2 seats, and along the table, 5 on the left and 4 on the right. The City of Silver team's eyes also followed the chiefs and took in the corresponding scene. The 5 figures on the left were the beautiful silver-haired man, the red-haired and arrogantly seated man, an elder wearing a hood that exposed only his mouth, winkles, and beard, a dignified middle-aged man dressed in black armor, and a handsome man dressed in white robes. The 4 on the right were a black-robed mummy wrapped in bandages, a middle-aged man with facial features resembling the natives of the southern continent, a giant covered in silver armor, and a supple, beautiful, and dignified lady. The 2 high-back chairs at the very end were a man with dark black curly hair and a woman shrouded in fog. At that moment, a guardian raised his right hand and pointed at the handsome white-robed man. His figure is made up of mysterious symbols. These symbols represent white angel, Aucuses. Before the guardian could finish his sentence, he suddenly let out a tragic cry as golden flames spewed out from his body. He instantly became a charred corpse, as if it would be reduced to ashes the moment it was touched. It made demon hunter Colin and shepherd Lovia incapable of saving him in time. Don't try to distinguish those symbols. They contain immense power, Colin hurriedly warned the others. And above the grey fog, Klein was thinking of another matter, White Angel Aucuses. That's the eternal blazing sun's true name? If not for the fact that the giant king's court itself isolates itself from projected powers, just using Jotun to read this name will attract his attention and incur divine punishment. Amidst his thoughts, demon hunter Colin stabbed his swords in front of him, creating an invisible barrier. Then, this city of silver chief identified the symbols and labels that formed those figures. He began reading it slowly and firmly from the left. Angel of Fate, Ouroboros. War Angel, Medici. Wisdom Angel, Haraburgen. At this point, the invisible barrier that was constantly shaking suddenly stopped. This was because this name was no stranger to the people of the City of Silver. This was the true name of the Dragon of Wisdom. Could it be that the Dragon of Wisdom later became the Wisdom Angel next to the Lord? Similar questions arose in everyone's hearts, but Klein discovered something strange. The history of the City of Silver had records of the name Haraburgen. The language they used on a daily basis was Jotun, a language that could mobilize the surrounding forces of nature. This also meant that, in the past 2,000 to 3,000 years, someone in the City of Silver had definitely read or written the name Haraburgen before, but there was no response from the god of knowledge and wisdom. The Church of Knowledge and Wisdom still wasn't able to find the forsaken land of the gods. At this moment, Colin Iliad controlled his emotions and continued reading, Wind Angel, Leodoro. White Angel, Aucuses. Dark Angel, Sasrar. Evernight Goddess, Ammonizes. God of Combat, Badhile. Earth Mother, Omabella _ God of the Dead, Salinger. God of Spiritual Creatures, Tolsna. Although Klein had expected this, he was still somewhat stunned. The former Rose Redemption was frighteningly powerful. Amongst the 7 deities today, 6 of them were members. There was also Death, the god of spiritual creatures, and 3 kings of angels. This made him recall what the Red Angel Evil Spirit had once said: Rose Redemption has a close relationship with the birth of the true Creator. It's impossible for you to imagine that certain people were once members of Rose Redemption, but they've since left it. Chapter 11:18 Klein's fear in the past. Rose Redemption could be called the Deity Alliance. But such an organization could only develop itself quietly under the might of the ancient sun god. It had to hide, and secretly scheme in the Palace of Dusk. How powerful was the ancient sun god in the past? Klein couldn't help but let out a breath as he felt deeply poignant. He examined his own tarot club and realized that, compared to the Rose Redemption, it was like child's play. Even if he counted the auxiliary members, Will Oseptin, Palaz Zoroast, Azek Eggers, and Rionette Tynker, there was no way to compare with the Rose Redemption at its peak. No, even if I compare it with the current watered-down version of Rose Redemption, there's still a huge gap between it and the Tarot Club. After all, its leader and convener is only a sequence 4 saint. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he turned his attention to the 11 figures. Based on their images, titles, and true names, I can confirm that the Wind Angel, Wisdom Angel, and White Angel are the current Lord of Storms, the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, and the Eternal Blazing Sunday. They really betrayed the ancient sun god, the City of Silver's creator, and they even feasted on the deity they served. The God of Combat and Earth Mother are indeed survivors of the Giant King's court. One of them is the eldest son of the Giant King, and the other is his queen. They're mother and son, so that way, the fact that Fanapotter didn't directly declare war on the Lord of Storms to help Faysak makes things a little odd. It requires some thought. Also, the goddess was indeed a former subsidiary god of the Annihilation demonic wolf, the goddess of misfortune, Amonizes. After that ancient god perished, not only did she grasp the authority of the Evernight and successfully ascend to the throne of Sequence Zero, she also single-handedly destroyed all the descendants of Phlegria, sealed the Antigonus family's angel within the nation of the Evernight, and used the Mother of the Sky's body as her vessel for a descent. That's ruthless. Read more chapters at allnovelful. Calm as a blessed of Evernight, Klein subconsciously raised his head to look around when he thought of this, afraid that his inner thoughts would leak out to the outside world. After entering the foggy town and learning that Antigonus and the Mother of the Sky were the descendants of the ancient god, Phlegria, Klein had a certain idea as to the true identity of the Evernight goddess. After all, in the history of the City of Silver, it clearly stated that the Annihilation demonic wolf controlled the authority of the Evernight and had many strange powers. Combined with the Antigonus family's possession of the Seer pathway, and the Mother of the Sky of the Nation of the Night clearly belonging to Evernight, Klein suspected that the Annihilation demonic wolf Phlegria was an ancient god that had mixed two non-neighboring pathways beyond her characteristics. Therefore, he was extremely crazy and almost irrational. His goal was to destroy and corrupt everything. Hence, he guessed that the Evernight goddess might have something to do with the ancient god, Phlegria. From Grozel's travels, he learned that one of the two subsidiary gods of the demonic wolf king had gone missing after he perished, while the other had submitted to the phoenix ancestor. Furthermore, that true name corresponded to death of the fourth epoch, Mr. Azek's father. With that, he could vaguely connect the goddess of misfortune Amonizes to the Evernight goddess. However, due to his temporary status as a blessed of Evernight, he didn't dare think too much about it. Instead, he focused his attention elsewhere. At this moment, when he saw her real name, he wasn't too shocked. Instead, he felt relieved and felt as though he were on firm ground. In addition, he was even more fearful of the Evernight goddess. Because she didn't want the ancient god, Phlegria, to be revived, the goddess controlled the various matters of the Seer pathway, preventing Beyonders who aren't cleared by her to advance further. That's right, that ecclesiastic in Afternoon Town mentioned who tempted Dark Angel Sassurer, the left hand of God, and the deputy of the divine kingdom, but he couldn't say the name, as if it had been erased. Isn't this a demonstration of concealment powers? Other than a place like the Giant King's Court, there's no way to say the names Evernight Goddess and Amonizes together. Even if one did, no one would be able to hear it. There are two people who convened Rose Redemption, one is Dark Angel Sassurer, and the other is the goddess. Apart from the venue where the ploy was conceived, it's filled with the forces of concealment. In other words, the goddess had single-handedly directed the fall of the ancient sun god, started the cataclysm, and ended the third epoch. Compared to her, be it Adam or Amon, they are still far from her. How could such a true deity be so easily trapped by Adam's arrangements and be unable to interfere with matters of the real world? Although it's not a conspiracy where something the goddess yearns for the most is used, making her willingly walk into a trap, how can the goddess, who wields the powers of concealment and plotted the death of the City of Silver creator, be unprepared? Also, what does "this is also in line with his thoughts" mean? Who does he refer to? After understanding so much hidden history, will I digest the scholar of your potion on the spot once I drink it? With this in mind, Klein raised his right hand and rubbed his temples, forcing himself to focus his thoughts elsewhere. When that ecclesiastic phantom mentioned the fourth king of angels, it self-destructed. Was it because the remaining three became true gods? However, the residents of the City of Silver would occasionally use the names Badheil and Harabergen, so why wasn't there an anomaly? What is the difference? The strongest among the kings of angels, the left hand of God, Sassurer, why did he disappear into the rivers of history? Perhaps he is one of the present-day evil gods, the true creator, the dark side of the universe, or the mother tree of desire? There are remnants of the godhood of degeneracy outside the hall. Was this left behind by him? Yes, the birth of the true creator is related to the rose redemption. How will he react when he sees the murals in this hall? With a thought, Klein cast his gaze at Shepherd Elder Lovia. The lady looked a little lost. She didn't seem to understand the titles and names, but she recognized a portion of them. For example, Angel of Fate Ouroboros. She had become a believer of the true creator in the temple ruins left behind by Ouroboros. Derek also stole a glance at Elder Lovia, but he didn't notice any obvious changes in her emotions. As the son of the Tarot Club, Derek was one of the people present who knew the situation of the outside world the most. Furthermore, he had long known who the kings of angels were. He suspected that 3 of them had later become deities. At this moment, he was the least confused and perplexed. He was only slightly shocked at Rose Redemption's level. This was more exaggerated than he had imagined. It's no wonder the Lord perished. Derek was first enlightened before he felt his heart turn heavy. At this moment, he swept his gaze and saw the chief's face turn pale and ugly. He even muttered a few words softly, "This is impossible, impossible. As far as I can remember, the chief has never lost his composure like this." Did he think of the Lord perishing due to Rose Redemption? He can't accept that he will never return. However, he had long learned of this from me. Just as Derek was feeling puzzled, he discovered that, aside from his tightly pursed lips, the chief's expression had returned to normal. In the minds of the other members of the exploration team, the prophecy they had previously learned in Afternoon Town appeared, "Omnipotent Lord, I repent." Tempted Sasrer. The kings often came to the palace belonging to the dusk to conspire. It was already too late by the time I discovered all of this. Degeneration, bloodshed, darkness, rot, murders, corruption, and shadows had already drowned this piece of land. A huge calamity will begin here. Chaim, who was holding the unshadowed crucifix, took a long while to calm his emotions. He said in a slightly hoarse voice, "This is the place belonging to the dusk. These are the subsidiary gods and kings of angels during the second epoch. They plotted everything, causing a huge calamity to happen. They made the Lord forsake this land?" Colin Iliad pulled out the 2 swords in front of him and half turned around, calmly replying, "Most likely. If we can figure out what exactly happened back then, do we have a chance to please the Lord and let him look at this land again?" Upon hearing the chief's answer, Antiona asked anxiously. At that moment, Derek seemed to see a trace of pity and sadness in the chief's eyes. He heard him acknowledge and say, "Perhaps. Then let's continue exploring." The other team members pleaded with burning eyes. This was the closest the City of Silver had gotten to having a glimmer of hope over the past 2,000 to 3,000 years. None of them wished to let it go, even if they had to sacrifice their lives for it. Colin Iliad slowly surveyed the area and said, "Don't forget the principles to uphold during explorations. Don't act rashly at any time. Having confirmed that this place is related to redemption, we can always come a second time, a third time, or even more. There's no need to be so impatient." Upon hearing his words, the other members of the exploration team calmed down. They replied one after another, "Yes, Your Excellency." Under the arrangements of Demon Hunter Colin, the remaining members split up into small groups and carefully searched the hall. They didn't discover anything else that was valuable beyond the murals. Read more chapters at allnovelful.com. Of course, it wasn't that there was no such thing. This was, after all, a divine kingdom of an ancient god. What seemed like an ordinary long table, chairs, stone pillars, and torches might have special effects when taken outside. Furthermore, those effects could last for a very long period of time. Alas, it wasn't convenient for the City of Silver's expedition team to bring them around, as they lacked practical value. As for the other murals, they were profiled from different angles of the main murals. When combined, they formed a 3-dimensional scene. After completing the search, Derek and company gathered again and followed the chief to the exit at the back of the hall. There was a gray-blue door with a single pane. With a 10-meter-tall door between the two of them, Colin Iliad carefully observed for a while before finally saying, "There's a powerful guard outside." Chapter 11:19 Tacit Cooperation. Upon hearing the chief's words, Shepherd Lovia immediately raised her question, just like the two silver knights at the front gate of the king's court. "It won't take the initiative to attack targets outside a certain range?" Colin Iliad nodded slightly and said, "At least that's how it seems to be at the moment." They were already near the exit, but the guard outside had no reaction. This meant that the other party didn't possess real intelligence or spirituality. It was very likely that they were objects that came to life. Without waiting for the other members to speak, Demon Hunter Colin continued, "Huge, heavy." After obtaining the corresponding information, the City of Silver's group formed a tacit understanding. A team opened up a distance from the exit, but they faced towards the door. It was protected by Shepherd Elder Lovia. As the bait to attract the guards, a team took the corresponding holy oil from the chief and smeared it across the ground at the exit. Hyam, who held the unshadowed crucifix, and Demon Hunter Colin stood by the side of the door and used the stone columns to hide. Then, Colin Iliad sheathed one of his swords onto his back and took out a small metal bottle, gulping down the liquid inside. His aura rapidly faded away and wasn't obvious anymore. If one didn't look closely, they wouldn't be able to discover his existence. This was another setup. Hyam was in the open, while the demon hunter was hidden. After another 10 seconds, Shepherd Lovia stretched out her right hand and grabbed at thin air. Her silver-gray hair was dyed a deep blue color. The wind howled as the grayish-blue door opened. Right on the heels of that, heavy footsteps could be heard, causing the entire hall to shake. A giant, covered in iron-colored armor rushed into the hall with a halberd in hand. Its exposed parts didn't show any flesh or blood, as though they were made of metal. Behind the black mask was a dark red glow. If it didn't move and stood there, it wouldn't be any different from a statue. Tap. 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 The shaking in the hall became more and more obvious. The giant statue suddenly threw out the halberd in its hand, stirring up a hurricane that tore towards Derek and company at the door. Boom! The halberd struck an invisible barrier as the illusory ripples rapidly spread out. In front of Shepherd Lovia, an illusory figure that wore silver armor had appeared at some point in time. It stabbed its great sword into the crack on the floor. Tap! 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 The giant statue didn't stop as it ran into the hall. At that moment, a whistling sound was heard under its feet as its massive body jerked backward. It had stepped on the spot that was smeared with holy oil. As the giant statue fell, the crimson light in its eye suddenly bloomed as an invisible force appeared and held it up. Suddenly, a blinding white light shot out from the unshadowed crucifix, accurately hitting the giant statue's only eye. The dark red color dimmed. Demon Hunter Colin leaped up and held the same sword with both hands, plunging it down like an eagle swooping down at its prey. Dawn appeared as they converged on the straight sword, making it exceptionally huge. It even exceeded Colin Iliad's height. With a poof, the bright sword pierced through the gap in the giant statue's armor, stabbing into its eye. A flood of light from the dawn rushed in. With his hand still gripping the hilt of his sword, Colin Iliad exerted more force. As the giant statue fell to the ground, he pulled out his sword and leaped to the side. The giant statue lay at the door as its body emitted cracking sounds until it finally all movement. Without looking at it again, Colin turned to look outside the door. After a few seconds, he said, "There are no other guards for now. We can handle this statue." Derek and company quickly surrounded the giant statue and skillfully searched for materials. Above the gray fog, Klein watched the entire battle from the sidelines and was deeply impressed by the City of Silver's teamwork. According to his observation, it was unknown what metal the giant statue was made of. Its surface was covered with armor that had shocking defensive strength. It could completely ignore most attacks in battle, and it was very difficult to deal with. Furthermore, this giant statue didn't have any spirit. In other words, it was immune to the beyonder powers of the corresponding domain, such as spirit-body threads control, hypnotism, frenzy, and nightmare. It was like a walking fortress that made one suspect that it was the work of the goddess of harvest. Klein believed that, if he were in their shoes, with the core powers of a bizarro sorcerer being useless, he could only rely on his two marionettes' powers to deal with the giant statue. He had no idea how the battle would develop. The distortion and disorder powers of an Earl of the Fallen might be effective, but I might not be able to finish it as fast as the City of Silver's expedition team. A team of Beyonders with a tacit understanding would be able to produce the effect of 1 + 1 greater than 2. Yes, that chief's confidence in timing, as well as his decisiveness in his attack, was also key. Klein nodded slightly, feeling a sense of admiration. If this were really a live stream, then he might not be able to help but send a gift as a tip. Of course, there was a high chance that it was just a thought. After taking away the most valuable item on the giant statue, the City of Silver's expedition team proceeded forward. They followed the corridor outside and entered another hall. Just like that, they weaved through the layers of palaces, towers, and different corridors, in an attempt to find more clues, as well as the entrance to the sea as described by the outsider, Jack. Regardless of whether they believed the boy's words, they couldn't help but look forward to the dark blue sea behind the giant king's court. On the other side of the sea, there were kingdoms where humans flourished. There were no monsters hidden in the darkness. The sun rose and set, and lightning only appeared when it rained. People had all sorts of food there. During this process, the City of Silver's expedition team didn't encounter many enemies. Most of them were statues that had come to life. A small number of them were evil spirits formed by the combination of remnant emotions and the power of dusk. The latter was unable to put up any resistance against the unshadowed crucifix. That's normal. The fool Klein above the gray fog nodded slightly, expressing his acceptance of the current situation. After the giant king perished, this place already belonged to the ancient sun god. It's unlikely that there will be a large number of giant powerhouses and mystical items left behind. When the kings of angels were conspiring, they definitely eliminated any unnecessary troubles ahead of time. Once the ancient sun god was eaten up, the ownership of this place was a mystery. Perhaps it was abandoned. In short, there aren't many foreseeable demigods or items. Well, without the unshadowed crucifix, those evil spirits will be very troublesome. The City of Silver's expedition team might not be able to advance so smoothly, making it impossible for them to advance so far unless an angel leads a team or activates a Grade 0 sealed artifact. When the unshadowed crucifix returned to Derek, the City of Silver's expedition team was already very close to the tallest building in the giant king's court. The dusk here was extremely dense, as though it came from that palace. Once we leave this hall, we should come to the wing of the giant king's residence. Demon Hunter Colin got his bearings and direction before pointing ahead. Shepherd Elder Lovia nodded. Finally, there was some irresistible hope in her expression. Derek's heart beat faster, and he could no longer control his excitement. Then, he was placated by Antiona. After composing themselves, the people from the City of Silver entered the hall in front of them and saw that there were oil paintings hanging on both sides. These oil paintings depicted different giants. Some held bone flutes, some carried wind chimes, while others carried a 7-string guitar that matched their height. As the City of Silver's expedition team arrived, the giants in the oil painting suddenly came to life. They began playing their instruments, producing a beautiful tune. The light of dusk in the hall lit up a little. More and more food appeared on the long tables around them as they glowed with a tempting glisten, effusing a very tempting fragrance. roasted chicken, roasted goose, fish with honey baste. Is this a dinner banquet for the giant king's court? But aren't the sizes of those chickens, geese, goats, and fish too large? The work of the goddess of harvest? With a glance, Klein confirmed that the food that appeared was an illusion. After all, the giant king's court no longer had any ingredients, nor did it possess anyone who could envision or create them. This is normal food? Hyam, who was holding Thunder God's roar, stared straight at one of the long tables. His Adam's apple bobbed. Maybe. Derek sniffed and couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. Apart from the black-faced grass, they had never seen normal food. The meat that the monsters roasted was of different colors, but they also tasted equally as bad. It could even poison them. Demon Hunter Colin stared for a few seconds before sighing. They're all fake. Don't come into contact with them, or there might be unnecessary accidents. Other than Lovia, the team from the City of Silver retracted their gaze with great difficulty. They followed the chief all the way to the exit of the hall. After a series of inspections, Colin Iliad inserted his swords into the ground and pushed open the heavy door. A crack appeared as rich orange light shone inside. As the gap grew bigger, the towering palace gradually became clear. Then, the people from the City of Silver heard a crashing sound. At this moment, Colin drew out a sword and suppressed the restlessness in his team members' hearts. He then drew out his other sword and slowly walked out of the hall. Derek and the others followed cautiously. After completely bathing in the light of dusk, they looked to the left at the same time. There were railings formed from stone pillars. Beyond the railings, there was an orange-red cloud that was gently ebbing at the distance. On the endless swath of dark blue, they emitted crashing sounds. There was no need for anyone to explain. At the same time, the members of the City of Silver's exploration team recalled the records in the book and Jack's description. A term flashed in their minds: the sea. Previous index. Next, add bookmarks. Input title/author. Home. My Bookshelf Cookies app. Chapter 11:20 Court Chaser. The dark blue, boundless sea that ebbed gently and seemed to contain infinite life was presented to members of the City of Silver's expedition team. It was no longer a record written down in ancient books, nor was it a combination of words spoken by outsiders. Although it was still very far away, it seemed like contact was possible. The wine-red-haired Antiona watched in a daze. She opened her mouth, as though she wanted to say something, but in the end, all she said was the words, "the sea." Just as she finished speaking, a silver crack suddenly appeared on her forehead. The crack shot up rapidly, instantly splitting Antiona into two halves. Warm and bright red blood gushed out, splashing across Derek's face. Without a sound, more silvery white light shot out from her body, splitting her body into countless small pieces of flesh. The reveling face full of hope was like a puzzle that had fallen to the ground, splattering everywhere. It was only at this moment that Demon Hunter Colin reacted. He brandished his two swords and slashed them diagonally outwards, as though he was dealing with invisible enemies. Clang! 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 Silver light flashed, and the sound of metal reverberating echoed. The morning sun around Colin Iliad shattered and scattered in chaos. At this moment, the silver phantom behind Shepherd Lovia had already taken a step forward and stabbed the blurry giant sword into the ground. Clang! 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 As they surrounded the people of the City of Silver, the streaks of silver light appeared in different spots, trying their best to cut through the invisible barrier around them like insects struggling in amber. Clang! 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 The dense, sometimes thick silver light constantly appeared, causing the defensive powers of the expedition team to tremble, as though it would shatter at any moment. However, be it Demon Hunter Colin, Shepherd Lovia, or Derek, they couldn't find any traces of the enemy. The fool above the grey fog was just about to give a certain reminder when the chief of the six-member council seemed to realize something and crossed his two swords in front of him. Clang! The gigantic silver beam struck the two swords, causing Demon Hunter Colin's feet to sink into a solid stone slab. He took this opportunity and roared, "Unshadowed domain." Upon hearing the chief's reminder, Derek didn't hesitate and stabbed his finger on the thorns of the unshadowed crucifix, doing so without any regard for the pain. As his blood oozed out, clear, bright, pure, and blazing light suddenly exploded, enveloping the entire area between the two buildings. There wasn't a single shadow in this area that could hide. Nothing else could be hidden. Light had become the ruler of this region. A huge figure quickly outlined itself on the side of the giant king's palace. It was wearing silver full-body armor and was nearly 5 meters tall. The flickering light behind the mask was either deep red or orange. And unmistakably, there was a single vertical eye there. This was a giant who was still alive. He didn't wait for the enemy to enter a certain range before attempting to attack, implying that he had sufficient intelligence. Unlike the other silver-armored knights, the giant's bracer had bright patterns on it. On the right was a blood-red color that circled around his arm, and at the same spot on the left, it was adorned with black spots. The giant knight raised his broadsword and pointed at everyone in the city of Silver. He said in a thunderous voice, "How dare you barge into the king's court and disturb Lord Sasrar's slumber?" Sasrar? Dark Angel Sasrar? The fool Klein above the grey fog was alarmed when he heard that. He subconsciously sat up straight. The former left hand of God, the deputy of the divine kingdom, the leader of the kings of angels, one of the two leaders of Rose Redemption, hadn't disappeared into the river of history. He was sleeping deep in the giant king's court, sleeping in the residence of the giant king. Why did he choose to enter a state of slumber? Many thoughts flashed through Klein's mind as he subconsciously cast his gaze towards the palace that the giant knight was guarding. It was the tallest and most magnificent building in the giant king's court. The dusk's light seemed to transform into something corporeal that covered its surface, dyeing it with a clear sense of decline. It gave off the feeling that the sun had set and an eternal eventide was coming. On both sides were steeples, while on the other side were spires. The front door was a double door that opened outwards, with grey and blue as the main colors. Its height exceeded 10 meters, and it was covered with symbols, labels, and patterns. It looked stately and mysterious. There was a pitch-black socket on the left side of the door at a height of 3 to 4 meters tall. It was equivalent to an adult's fist. Upon seeing this scene, Klein suddenly thought of the dream divination he had done in the past. Back then, he had seen the same scene, and the medium he had used for the divination was the giant's key he had obtained from Vice Admiral Iceberg. Is that the key to opening the giant king's residence? As he extended his hand, he tried to use his true vision to pass through the obstruction of the building to see the situation inside the palace. Unfortunately, he failed. The iron-black key, which was the size of a 7-string guitar, landed in front of him. At this moment, Demon Hunter Colin suddenly said before the giant knight attacked, "You're a court chaser?" The giant knight's broadsword didn't cleave down. Instead, he paused for a second and said in a low voice, "After all this time, to think that there's someone who can still remember court chasers. I'm the leader of all the chasers, the light color Merskogan, and I later followed Lord Sasrar. I once hunted powerful dragons, elves, devils, demonic wolves, phoenixes. Today, you are honored to die under my blade." This light color didn't soften his attitude. He hunched his body slightly and held his sword with both hands. Like a flying meteor, he rushed towards the people from the city of Silver with heavy footsteps at high speeds. Due to the existence of the unshadowed domain, he could no longer hide his body like before. Just as Colin Iliad, Lovia and company determined that Merskogan's attack would arrive in a second, this giant knight suddenly stopped his silver broadsword midway. Demon Hunter Colin, who wasn't in Lovia's evil spirit's defensive circle, suddenly had a premonition of danger. Without any hesitation, he lunged to the side. Boom! A silver ray of light suddenly emerged from the spot where he had been standing, destroying everything from within. This attack was so strange, like it was generated by the void itself. At the same time, there was also a change in Colin Iliad, who had ducked to the ground. His clothes were torn into pieces and cloth by his rapidly expanding muscles. In just a blink of an eye, this demon hunter had turned into a grayish-blue giant with bluish-black lines warped around him. At his forehead was a deep black crack. Every inch of him contained immense power, infinite mystery, and a strange psyche influence. If a Beyonder under Sequence 4 saw this scene, they would definitely suffer from a strong backlash. Their brains might suffer an excruciating pain that would cause them to lose their minds. Even their spirituality would be corrupted. And if they couldn't withstand such an influence, going crazy, losing control, or even sudden death were certain outcomes. This was the incomplete mythical creature form of a demigod. Originally, Colin Iliad didn't dare to release this form due to the influence of the twilight in the giant king's court. But now, he realized that in the unshadowed domain, the feeling of decline had weakened significantly. He then raised the two swords that had enlarged in size as well. With them covered in the light of dawn, he fought fiercely with the light color Merskogen in the domain that was enveloped in light and shadows. Clang! 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 The three swords of the giants clashed and separated from time to time. Although Colin Iliad was at a disadvantage, he still managed to withstand the barrage of attacks from the king's court chasers' leader. From time to time, he would feel a strong sense of danger. Then, without any warning, he would either duck or roll in another direction. And at this moment, silver beams of light would always appear from the inside and outside. Derek had already closed his eyes. Ignoring the loss of blood, he tried his best to maintain the unshadowed domain. Hyam and another Dawn Paladin similarly didn't dare open their eyes. They helped shepherd Elder Lovia and slowly moved the group towards the palace without exiting the protective domain. If not for the help of the silver-armored knight evil spirit, they would have long been diced into small pieces of flesh and blood by the storm of light that swept the area. That light color Merskogen alone had placed the City of Silver's expedition team into a precarious position, with no chance of counterattacking. As expected of the leader of the king's court chasers, this should be the strongest force beneath subsidiary gods, or in other words, angels. Compared to the demon hunter, the Silver Knight has several more terrifying Beyonder powers. Above the grey fog, the Fool Klein held the sea god scepter and carefully observed the battle. He quickly figured out the aspect in which light color Merskogen was powerful in. Firstly, his defensive power can be transformed into a full-body silver armor set. Secondly, it can be used to hide and conceal himself with the light, hiding any malicious intent. Thirdly, the condensed Sword of Dawn isn't something that can be maintained for a short period of time. It can be used as a normal weapon, sufficiently sharp, and good at cleansing. Fourth, it can create some sort of thin silver-white sword. It has the ability to teleport, and it can bypass most barriers to attack the target directly, and even cause it to erupt from within the target's body. Furthermore, this thin silver-white sword condensed without any warning, making it difficult to predict. This is a saint who's extremely good at fighting head-on. If it wasn't for the rich experience and strong intuition of the City of Silver's chief, he would have been in danger due to the suppression effect from being of the same pathway when fighting in his mythical creature form. If it were me, I might have already been killed. Of course, I wouldn't fight head-on with the leader of the king's court chasers. From the current situation, because the evil spirit needs to protect its shepherd, there's no way for it to directly participate in the battle. The City of Silver's expedition team has almost no chance of winning. Yes, they're already slowly retreating. Very rational. If it really doesn't work, perhaps Mr. Fool will have to deliver lightning punishment. However, the true creator should still be watching. My lightning storm might not be able to quickly resolve Merskogen. Klein's thoughts raced when he suddenly thought of a problem. How did light color Merskogen, who wasn't an angel, survive since the end of the second epoch? He's neither a demoness, vampire, nor undying. And from him possessing reason, as well as the ability he displays in battle, he doesn't have beyonder characteristics of other pathways mixed in him. Chapter 11:21 Weakness. Since light color Merskogen didn't gain his long lifespan from his beyonder characteristic, Klein could only begin considering external factors. The effects of a mystical item? No, he doesn't have any mystical items on him. Aside from the Giant King's residence, there's nothing in the vicinity either. However, that's the sleeping ground of Dark Angel Sassurer. Furthermore, the key is with me. I don't think Merskogen would dare or have the means to enter. Who took the key to the Giant King's residence after Sassurer fell into a slumber? Isn't that a bit too wicked? Of course, the palace without the powers of a deity augmenting it wouldn't be able to trap a king of angels. Or perhaps, this key had long been transported to the northern continent during the migration of the giants. Sassurer chose to sleep in the palace because, other than a small number of existences, no one can open the door and affect his sleep. Was Vice Admiral Iceberg's key given to me through a roundabout manner by the god of knowledge and wisdom? He wants to learn of Sassurer's present state. If it's not the effects of a mystical item, what could it be? Time given by an angel from the Marauder pathway? Ignoring the possibility of giving stolen illusory items to someone else, there needs to be an angel or a grade 0 sealed artifact from the Marauder pathway. And there aren't any similar existences nearby. Back then, Merskogen was given a lifespan of thousands of years at once. Perhaps only Amon is capable of doing that. Clearly, he wouldn't help Dark Angel Sassurer. In addition, this blasphemer's true body seems to be wandering around the forsaken land of the gods. If there were angels or grade 0 sealed artifacts of the Marauder pathway here, they might have become his food long ago. The cycle of fate? After light color Merskogen's natural death, everything begins with him guarding Sassurer again? Yes, that's possible. If the current Merskogen is in an aged state, then it's completely understandable how so much time has passed. Furthermore, because the time in this loop seals centuries, it hasn't reached a node yet. It's only normal that I didn't manage to discover any signs above the gray fog in my haste. With this in mind, he quickly observed his surroundings to find traces of the Angel of Fate, Ouroboros. However, there was no remnant power like that. Klein quickly retracted his gaze and continued to observe light color Merskogen's intense battle with Colin Iliad and the silver-armored knight Evil Spirit. His spirit body threads are normal, eliminating the possibility of him already becoming a marionette. Under true vision, his condition isn't abnormal. This means that he isn't a figure summoned from history. The divine kingdom of the Giant King's court is slowing down the passing of time or aging? The former can be eliminated because my spirituality is almost unable to support my level of observation. This matches the amount of time the City of Silver's exploration team has spent in this area. There is a certain chance of the latter, with life progressing in the sunset state but being solidified during dusk. But the problem is that the ancient god, the Giant King, has already perished. Badheil, who wields the power of dawn and the power of dusk, has brought the divine kingdom to the astral world. It's impossible for this king's court to still have such a powerful influence remaining within it. Klein went through all the possibilities of extending one's life that he could think of, but none of them matched the situation of the leader of the court chasers. He had no choice but to consider another possibility, a secret art with a huge defect. This should be dependent on some kind of power in the Giant King's court. Otherwise, the range of Merskogen's activities wouldn't be so tiny. It wouldn't take until the City of Silver's expedition team arrived at Carrot Residence before he took action. The entity related to life inside the giant king's court clearly exists, the former goddess of harvest, the present Earth Mother, giant Queen Omabella. As this thought flashed through his mind, he cast his gaze at the giant statues outside the palace. They were no different from the ones the City of Silver expedition team had encountered along the way. They were only slightly larger. However, after careful inspection, he noticed a small number of abnormalities. These giant statues had the aura of life, and they possessed a certain amount of spirituality. However, behind the mask, it was pitch black without any dark red glow. This light color Merskogen had used some sort of secret technique in the life domain to bind his spirit with the living statues. Using them, he obtained a long life, but this results in him being limited to such a tiny region and being unable to leave. This is very similar to the way evil spirits exist. This way, Merskogen might not be able to show his normal mythical creature form. Klein conjured a gold coin and flipped it up to make confirmation. When he received an affirmation, he raised the sea god scepter high and prepared to remind Little Sun through the prayer light. At this moment, Demon Hunter Colin, who had avoided Merskogen's first attack, suddenly ducked and circled around him, running straight for the giant king's residence from the side. His gaze was locked onto those gigantic statues. In the intense battle just now, although this City of Silver chief had always been at a disadvantage, he didn't give up on observing his surroundings, nor did he stop thinking. He was similarly puzzled as to why the leader of the court chasers could live for thousands of years. When he discovered that the living giant statues were only standing outside the palace without participating in the battle, he had arrived at a certain conclusion. He didn't know what exactly was going on, what principles underlay it, or what domain it belonged to, but his rich experience in exploration, and the intuition as a demon hunter, made him believe that the statues were the crux of the problem. Tap! 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 With two swords in his hands, Colin Iliad dashed forward, taking large strides. However, he didn't run in a straight line as he zigzagged his way forward. Upon seeing this scene, Light Color Merskogen let out an angry roar as he held the broadsword in his hands and rapidly slashed forward. His reaction proved that Colin Iliad's judgment was correct. Bang! 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 Demon Hunter Colin suddenly leaped away and did a roll. And above his original trajectory, silver light appeared out of thin air and exploded, forming a long snake. It completely lifted the solid ground of the king's court, tearing open a deep chasm. With a loud thud, Light Color Merskogen took a step forward. His nearly 5-meter-tall body bent and smashed the silver broadsword in his hand onto the ground. Clang! The area shook violently as the pillars snapped and fell into the orange cloud beneath. The ground between the two buildings exploded layer by layer, sending countless gravel flying. As for Demon Hunter Colin, he had already leaped up ahead of time and was in midair. He crossed his swords, creating an invisible barrier that blocked the rubble that resembled an arrow. At this moment, Merskogen, who had his back bent his knee and exerted strength into it. His massive body shot out like a meteor, instantly closing the distance between him and Demon Hunter Colin. During this process, the silver broadsword in his hands moved upwards. Seeing that Demon Hunter Colin was no longer able to dodge, a bright light suddenly shot over, accurately hitting Merskogen's broadsword. With a loud clang, Colin Iliad tumbled to the ground and finally approached the giant statues in one swift move. At the same time, he saw from the corner of his eye that the silver-armored Night Phantom in front of Elder Lovia had long drawn out its giant sword. It had condensed the light of dawn into a huge bow as it shot out arrows consecutively. Light Color Merskogen's single eye had already been dyed with a layer of red. He didn't care about the arrows of light, and he allowed them to hit his body as they produced clanking sounds. He kept charging forward and brandished his broadsword, causing silver light to appear from different parts of the void. He chased after the giant like Demon Hunter Colin, preventing him from attacking those giant statues. Suddenly, an arrow that was gathered from the lustrous brilliances tore past Merskogen and silently hit the gap in his visor. This was from the evil spirit that Shepherd Lovia grazed. Demon Hunter Colin was merely bait. It was the real attacker. Swoosh! 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 One arrow after another flew past, but this time, they were all blocked by Merskogen. But at that moment, the demon hunter had already positioned himself well. He aimed at the remaining giant statues and swung his two straight swords that were enveloped by the light of dawn. Light bloomed as a hurricane of light blanketed the area. With continuous cracking sounds, the statues collapsed to the ground. Meanwhile, the aura of the light color Merskogen rapidly declined. This King's Court Chaser leader immediately roared, "Let's die together." The silver broadsword in his hand exploded, splintering into countless fragments of light. They formed a terrifying storm that swept everything around them. The silver-armored knight Evil Spirit and Demon Hunter Colin simultaneously stabbed their swords into the ground, creating an invisible barrier. The dazzling white light swept between the two buildings, destroying the grayish-blue door and stone pillars behind Derek and company. However, when they swept into the giant king's residence, they failed to affect it completely. After an unknown period of time, just as Derek thought that the invisible barrier was about to be torn apart by the hurricane of light, the rays of light finally dimmed. In the ruins, the silver armor on the body of light-color Merskogen slowly faded away, revealing his grayish-blue body that was wearing linen clothes. Not far away from him, Demon Hunter Colin's body was covered in blood. He was transforming from a giant back to his normal state, but his aura was relatively stable. It was just that he had weakened greatly. With a clang, Merskogen genuflected as his flesh rapidly aged, decomposed, and evaporated. Under the orange light, he seemed to see the lively king's court once again. In the frozen dusk, giants came and went, playing the seven-stringed guitar or bone flute, wrestling, or enjoying the delicacies that they could eat at any time. The passing of their lives moved extremely slowly, and their king sat on a high throne, watching everything from above with a stately demeanor. After that incident, none of that existed, so he chose to follow Dark Angel Sasrer. A smile appeared on Merskogen's face as he opened his mouth and softly shouted, "King." This court chaser bowed his head, his flesh and blood completely evaporated, leaving behind a huge white skeleton and silvery white light that had condensed together. Chapter 11:22 The Instructions of the Fool Above the Grey Fog. When Klein saw light-color Merskogen rapidly age and decompose into bones, he suddenly recalled Mobit, Ciatas, Frunzier, and Snowman when they left Grozel's travels. He didn't have the time to stop it back then, and it was no different this time. This was because the leader of the King's Court Chasers had never chanted the honorific name of the Fool, so he was unable to pull him above the grey fog. However, compared to before, with the Sea God's scepter in hand, he could now do more things by using the prayer light. He immediately accommodated the Black Emperor card and activated the powers of the mysterious space above the grey fog. He made the paper angel carry his own words and used the Crimson Star to enter the real world and land on the remnant spirit of light-color Merskogen. This was one of the methods that wouldn't lower his loftiness as the Fool. After all, the true creator was still watching the area. As Merskogen's consciousness was rapidly wiped out of existence, an angel with black wings suddenly appeared in front of him. The speed at which his spirit body collapsed slowed down as he heard a loud and majestic voice. "What is the advancement ritual and supplementary ingredients of the Silver Night Potion? Is Sasra really sleeping in the palace of the Giant King?" Merskogen replied blankly, "The advancement ritual of the Silver Night comes from the blasphemy slate. It needs a complicated altar to be set up, placing the remains of the 6 powerful creatures one had hunted in the correct positions, and receive the blessings of a deity. The supplementary ingredients are... I can't be certain." In short, that door didn't open after Lord Sasrer entered. Amidst the response, the spirit of Merskogen's spirit slowly but firmly dissipated. Finally, he could no longer hold on as he was reduced to points of light that merged into the still dusk of the giant king's court. And this conversation happened within the soul domain, so no one else could hear it. Thankfully, I'm careful enough to not let Merskogen say the main ingredient of the Silver Night potion. Anyway, the Beyonder characteristic can be used to replace whatever it is. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to hear the answer to the second question. The fool heaved a sigh of relief and praised himself inwardly. He then focused and seriously thought about what Merskogen had just said. A deity's blessing? Isn't this advancement ritual a little too difficult? It's only sequence 3. I have to consider the circumstances of his timeline. Merskogen is a powerhouse who survived from the second epoch. It was a habit to call an angel a subsidiary god, and include them in the ranks of a god. That also means that the blessings of an angel should be sufficient. Yes, I'll use divination to confirm this later. Of course, even if an angel's blessings are sufficient, I'm unable to do anything for the time being. It will depend if the Grade 0 sealed artifacts in the City of Silver have any living characteristics that can also be communicated with. The act of setting up that altar is actually a little complicated. Must the remains of the 6 powerful creatures that one has personally killed have to be at the demigod level? It's very difficult for demon hunters outside the forsaken land of the gods. How can there be so many demigod-level creatures to be killed? Most of them are protected by their corresponding organizations. From the looks of it, the Church of the God of Combat should have a new substitute method while maintaining the essence of the ritual. Is this the difference between the first and second blasphemy slate? However, for a young chief like the City of Silver, he must have killed more than 6 powerful monsters. That's easy. As he was currently certain that the second blasphemy slate had appeared after the ancient sun god's death, he was able to determine that light color Merskogen was referring to the first blasphemy slate. He quickly conjured a piece of parchment from his interpretation of the advancement ritual and supplementary ingredients. Then, a divination with a topaz spirit pendulum was performed, to which he received a revelation that there were no mistakes. Then, he threw this message to the crimson star representing the sun. This is a gift from Mr. Fool. After doing all of this, Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh. He increasingly felt that the answer to the second question was worth ruminating. He didn't say if Sasra was truly asleep. He only said that the door hadn't opened after the Dark Angel entered. And the only thing that didn't open was the door. The God of Knowledge and Wisdom gave me the key, and Adam gave me the unshadowed crucifix. Was it done to open the door to confirm the Dark Angel's condition? As his thoughts raced, he suddenly felt lucky. Fortunately, the true creator wasn't too interested in this. If this entity had sent down his will just now and tried to influence Merskogen's dissipating spirit, he would have clashed with the fool's paper angel on the spot. That would be rather awkward. Only at that moment did Derek dare to open his eyes. His face was pale from having lost too much blood. In order to maintain the unshadowed domain, he had allowed the cross to absorb quite a bit of his blood. He looked around and placed the unshadowed crucifix in front of him as he sincerely thanked Mr. Fool. At that moment, Hyam put away Thunder God's roar and his weapon. He removed the leather bag on his back and found a set of clothes to throw to the chief. To the City of Silver's exploration team, as long as they weren't wearing clothes and armor that were mystical items, it was inevitable that their clothes would suffer damage during battle. Therefore, they definitely prepared a few additional sets ahead of time. To them, the purpose of clothing covering their bodies was secondary. The most important thing was to leave space to store materials, ointments, and charms. Colin Iliad looked around vigilantly, but he didn't find anything unusual. He quickly put on his clothes and found one of the small metal bottles that had fallen all over the ground during the battle. He removed the lid and gulped it down. His face turned a little green as if he had been poisoned. However, his wounds and the signs of decline were improving. As for Lovia, she was no longer able to maintain the grazing of the silver-armored knight, and she placed it back inside her body. By the time Merskogen's Beyonder characteristic condensed into a silvery white luster that resembled a miniature sun or heart, it was put away by demon hunter Colin. This shepherd elder looked at the nearby palace with his grey eyes and said, "Chief, the path to the sea might very well be hidden there." Lovia paused for a moment before adding, "Perhaps there's another way to get to the other side of the sea." As Colin Iliad watched Derek, Hyam, and the others clean up the battlefield, pick up items, and deal with the mutilated corpse of Antiona, he shook his head and said, "The Dark Angel is sleeping inside, and he is definitely a king of angels, one we are currently unable to resist. Even facing him will be very difficult. Let's head back first and inform everyone that we have seen the sea before making preparations for entry into the Giant King's palace." Lovia's silver-gray hair fluttered slightly as she wore a solemn expression. "But we don't know anything. We can't make any targeted preparations." After saying that, she fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, "I have a suggestion. You, Derek, Hyam, and the others can head back first. I'll stay behind and attempt to enter the palace to gather useful information. I can fuse into the shadows and perhaps not disturb that Dark Angel. If I don't return, it means that the danger inside has exceeded the limits we can handle." When Lovia mentioned that she might die, her expression didn't change at all, as if she had long been prepared. Colin listened quietly and stared at her for a few seconds. "No, we can't bear such risks. If you awaken the Dark Angel, he might leave the Giant King's court and attack the City of Silver, but we definitely won't be able to resist against him." Without waiting for Lovia's reply, Colin Iliad turned his head and looked at the other 3 members. "Derek, what's your opinion?" "My opinion?" Derek was somewhat at a loss. He nearly blurted the question back out. Hyam and the other Dawn Paladin were equally shocked. This was because this was an internal conflict among the 6-member council. Colin Iliad had actually asked for Derek Berg's opinion. Could it be that the chief has been nurturing Derek as the next elder of the 6-member council? The 2 members of the expedition team looked thoughtfully at their teammates. "This is him asking for my opinion?" The fool Klein above the grey fog frowned slightly. His brain immediately began to churn rapidly. "What views can I have? If they were to open the door and awaken Sasra, I wouldn't be able to save any of them. All I can do is get them to ask for the help of the true Creator. Let's wait until I figure out the situation regarding the Dark Angel from the Red Angel Evil Spirit and other related existences before beginning the exploration. I don't have to worry about the Dragon of Wisdom and Adam's thoughts for now. No matter what, there's nothing wrong with choosing to be calm and cautious at such times." As his thoughts raced, Klein sternly said, "Return." He then projected this image into the crimson star representing the sun. Derek was stunned for 2 seconds before calmly answering the chief's question. "I think we should give up for now and wait until we're ready." Colin Iliad nodded and said to Shepherd Lovia, "This is my decision." Lovia fell silent for a moment before saying, "I will defer to your decision." She didn't say anything else as she helped Derek and company mark the area. As Antiona wasn't killed by a blood relative, there was a high possibility that an anomaly would happen. Therefore, the expedition team would mark the area, making the ones who arrived later to be more vigilant. However, they didn't need to worry about such effects since they were very far away from the City of Silver. While they busied themselves, Lovia suddenly looked up and said to Derek and Hyam, "This is the Giant King's court. There might not be any anomalies." She didn't explain as she looked at Antiona's pile of flesh that had been burned into ashes by the flames. She grabbed a handful of them and placed them inside her leather bag. After completing these matters, the City of Silver's expedition team found another passageway, but they obtained a disappointing outcome. Following that, under the lead of Chief Colin Iliad, they retraced their path back. After entering the palace that had already lost its main door while having the oil painting band playing their tunes, Derek couldn't help but turn his head to look outside at the broken railings again. He looked at the orange-red cloud in the distance, towards the deep blue sea. After staring at it for a few seconds, he retracted his gaze and realized that the chief's light blue eyes were also silently looking in that direction. Colin immediately turned his head and said calmly, "Let's go." Then, without turning back, he proceeded steadily. Chapter 11:23 After the expedition above the grey fog, when he saw that the City of Silver's exploration team had begun embarking on their way back as the Giant King's palace remained unchanged, Klein heaved a sigh of relief and leaned back in his chair, exhausted. After 2 hours of observation, his spirituality was nearing its limits. At most, he could hold out for another 15 minutes. Regardless, the things obtained from this expedition completely exceeded my imagination. It's only right to give the Silver Night potion formula to the City of Silver. As he rubbed his forehead, his thoughts began to wander. Being aware of these ancient secrets is very helpful to my digestion after my advancement. The problem now is that my Bizarro Sorcerer potion hasn't been fully digested. From the feedback I've been getting over this period of time, it can be seen that all sorts of strange tales are indeed useful. When Miss Magician completes the script and publishes it, it just needs some time to build up some momentum before it's done. However, she started writing a few days ago. I don't know when she will finish her manuscript. Why can't she just write a few more hours every day? When I went to pick her up this time, I should urge her. With this in mind, Klein suddenly recalled something. He hadn't given Anderson a reward for finding Vice Admiral Ailment. I'll wait until he helps Danitz become a conspirer. Anyway, this was also part of the agreement. The advancement ritual of an iron-blooded knight isn't difficult, but it's not simple either. Especially for a hunter, it's even more troublesome. It requires a hunter who is adept at provocation and enjoys coming up with ploys to build a team of at least 30 people, and also nurture a deep sense of friendship amongst them while making them strong. When they act almost as one, they'll set up the ritual. The greater the strength and camaraderie amongst the team, the better the effects of the ritual. Seeing that the City of Silver's expedition team was returning in an orderly manner without encountering any accidents, he finally felt at ease. He left the world above the grey fog and threw himself into bed, falling into a dream. After some rest at the afternoon town camp, Derek Berg finally recovered and his face was no longer as pale. He had just eaten bread made from black-faced grass powder when a figure grew out from the shadows outside and said in a low voice, "Derek, the chief is looking for you." "Yes." Derek subconsciously stood up. "Thank you." He was originally prepared to find the chief and hand over the Silver Night potion formula. After watching the messenger retreat into the shadows, he walked out of the room and arrived at the clearing where the bonfire was illuminated. At a glance, Derek saw many members who hadn't participated in the expedition gathered in groups of 2 or 3. They were excitedly discussing something. They already knew that one could see the sea from the Giant King's court. They knew that it wasn't too far from the coast, and as long as they found the correct path, they would arrive there in no time. This was an important step for the City of Silver to save themselves after discovering the outsider, Jack. The residents of the City of Silver, who mainly had the power of dawn, finally saw the light of dawn. Their long wait and persistence seemed to have paid off. Derek could understand the feelings of his team members because he was the same. However, from the world Gehrman Sparrow, he knew very well that the waters in the ruins of the Battle of Gods weren't that simple. To head to the other side of the sea would probably be extremely difficult. Ignoring everything else, just Dark Angel Sassurer, who was sleeping in the Giant King's palace and blocking the vital path outside, was a problem that he couldn't overcome at the moment. I can only hope that Mr. Fool will bless me. Yes, for that boy to appear in the temple ruins, it means that there are other paths that can bypass the Giant King's palace and reach the sea. Derek thought optimistically as he circled around the quietly burning bonfire and walked towards the chief's room on the other side. Suddenly, he saw a person sitting silently in the shadow of a boulder. It was a man in his 20s, and he was much taller than Derek. He held a pale gold bracelet with 3 small bells hanging on it as he looked at it with his pupils unfocused. Derek was no stranger to this man. He knew that he was the husband of Antiona, Dolores, a Sequence 6 Dawn Paladin. In the City of Silver, before the age of 18, one could date freely until they were married. And if one didn't have a partner at the age of 18, they would be arranged to have one. It was the same for widows and widowers after 3 years. This was a necessary measure to ensure the necessary population level for the City of Silver's continuation. It seemed like it was against human rights, but for the continuation of the entire city in the Dark Lands, it could only be done this way. Furthermore, this could ensure that everyone had a certain number of close relatives, preventing the possibility of mutating into a terrifying evil spirit after their death. As for Dolores and Antiona, they were neighbors who lived on the same street. They had known each other since they were young and had a good impression of each other. In the end, they started dating when they were teammates of a patrol team. Over time, they became husband and wife and had a deep, loving relationship. In light of how they had a young child, Colin Iliad had deliberately left one of them behind during the expedition to the Giant King's court. On the one hand, Derek felt that there was nothing wrong with the chief's arrangement, and on the other hand, he felt a strong sense of sorrow because of the way Dolores acted. It was as if he had returned to the state when he had to personally stab his parents to death. From the beginning to the end of the expedition, it only took half a day's time. However, to Dolores, it meant everything had changed. After a moment of silence, Derek retracted his gaze and continued forward, subconsciously taking a few heavy steps. At the same time, he thought of a rumor: Shepherd Elder Lovia once had a husband, but he died in an expedition. This was very common to begin with and wasn't worth discussing. However, other than Lovia, the team that explored the ruins of the temple had all gone mad. After they were eradicated, there were rumors that gradually spread among the residents of the City of Silver. During that expedition, Elder Lovia had eaten her husband. In the night, with low lightning frequency, the winds were rather cold. Derek shivered and turned his attention back to the scene before him. He took a few steps and arrived at his destination. He raised his hand and knocked on the chief's door. "Come in," Colin Iliad said calmly. Derek pushed open the door and entered. He saw the chief wearing a linen shirt and dark-colored coat wiping his 2 swords with oil. Colin Iliad didn't stop. He raised his head and looked at Derek. "What are your thoughts on this expedition? What's the chief's motive for asking this?" Having been influenced by Alger, Derek subconsciously had this thought. Unable to grasp the true intentions of the chief, he had no choice but to close the door and answer frankly: there might be other paths to the seaside. The palace of the Giant King should be very important, but that's too dangerous. We need more information. Colin Iliad nodded and asked, "The kings of angels and other existences who call themselves deities secretly plotted together because they wanted to resist the Lord? And their success caused this land to be forsaken?" Although Derek had never directly heard of such an inference, it wasn't difficult to come up with a similar conclusion based on the various secrets he had learned from the Tarot Club. Yes, that should be the case. Colin fell silent. Even his act of wiping his sword slowed down. After a few seconds, he put down the items in his hand and took 2 steps forward. "Those who participated in the conspiracy are still active on the other side of the sea?" After a moment of silence, Derek replied in deliberation, "Mostly. But not too much." Colin Iliad nodded, indicating that he had nothing else to ask. Derek hurriedly said, "Chief, I obtained the incomplete formula of the Silver Night Potion, including the supplementary ingredients and the advancement ritual during Light Color Merskogan's death." When he said this, Derek knew that his lie sounded overly fake. It could be seen through right away because he didn't even dare to open his eyes back then. However, he just couldn't think of a better excuse. If Mr. Hanged Man were here, he would definitely have a better solution. Just as this thought came to his mind, he heard the chief speak slowly, "Very good." "What is it?" Derek was stunned for a second before he hurriedly recounted the corresponding ritual and supplementary ingredients. Colin listened quietly and let out a long sigh. "You have contributed greatly this time. This is extremely important to the City of Silver. In the future, our limit will be Sequence 3 and not Sequence 4. Up to a certain range, the risk of the expedition teams will be greatly reduced." "Why will the risk encountered by the expedition teams be reduced and the upper limit is Sequence 3 within a certain range?" As Derek was happy that he had made such a contribution, he couldn't understand the chief's words. However, he knew that this was something he didn't have the right to understand. He planned on asking around at the tarot gathering later. He then bade farewell and opened the door. "Derek," Colin Iliad suddenly called out to him. Derek turned his head in puzzlement and found that the chief's expression was rather solemn. Colin fell silent for a while before shaking his head. "Be careful of Lovia." "Yes, Your Excellency," Derek replied from the bottom of his heart. Backlund, Northborough. Hazel took a carriage back to the city from Moose Manor, and she was preparing to meet Miss Audrey at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation to discuss matters regarding donations and help. After many interactions, she had a very good impression of this noble lady. She didn't feel pressured when beside her, and the strange emotions accumulated in her heart had mostly dissipated. She gradually recovered more of her forgotten memories. "I should have a teacher. What exactly happened that day? Every time I think about it, I tremble all over." Hazel cast her gaze out the window, feeling a little depressed. Her carriage was driving past the vicinity of Backlund Street. At this moment, a person dressed in the clothes of a mailman rode his bicycle horizontally across the carriage, looking rather relaxed. Hazel casually sized him up and saw a monocle on his right eye. Chapter 11:24 Enhanced Teammates. Hazel's gaze instantly froze as she felt something rapidly expanding in her mind. It was about to tear apart an invisible barrier and spew out. She instinctively looked away and curled up slightly. Then, she felt a ray of light shoot out from the depths of her heart, exploding into countless memory fragments in her mind as it howled, raging back and forth. She suddenly remembered what had happened at home that day. She recalled her father, mother, maid, and servants wearing monocles or pinching their eye sockets. The indescribable horror was so vivid, as though it had been carved into her bones. The expression on Hazel's face crumbled as she curled into a ball as she trembled. The maidservant in the carriage was stunned as she hurriedly stood up and reached out her hands in an attempt to help her up. "No!" Hazel trembled as she shouted with a nearly sharp voice. The maidservant was shocked and frightened. She stood rooted to the ground, not knowing how to react. After shouting, Hazel calmed down. She sat up and looked ahead in extreme fear. She saw the monocled postman enter another street, leaving only his back visible. I wasn't feeling well just now. I'm feeling much better now," Hazel turned her head and barely said to the maidservant. She realized that she wasn't as afraid as she remembered. It was as if she had already gotten used to the situation after some time. "If not, I might have lost control just now." Why would I use the word lose control? Thankfully, I forgot those memories and didn't do anything eye-catching when I saw the postman. It took me 10 seconds to break down. If not, I might have been detected, and something terrifying might have happened. Her thoughts flashed uncontrollably as her body trembled slightly. "Miss, do you need to go to the clinic?" the maidservant asked hurriedly. Hazel instinctively shook her head as her mind turned chaotic as she casually said, "Let's go to the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation first. I remember there's a private clinic nearby." "All right." The maidservant turned around and instructed the coachman to speed up. Hazel kept taking deep breaths in an attempt to regulate her tense emotions, panic, and fear. It had to be said that it was somewhat effective. She seemed to have calmed down a little instead of breaking down immediately. At that moment, a sparrow had appeared above the carriage at some point in time. It squeezed its right eye and spat out a human language with almost no sound. She seems to have some unnecessary misunderstanding about me. It looks like T had some interactions with her before. Ah, she's a resident of Buckland Street. Interesting. Before long, the carriage arrived at Phelps Street. Seeing that the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation wasn't far away, Hazel suddenly said, "To the cathedral. Turn toward St. Samuel Cathedral first. I want to pray." She wanted to tell the bishops what had happened that day and what she saw today. In the gap of the carriage, a black ant moved its feeler on its right and whispered in a human voice, "Humans nowadays are really lacking in creativity. They go to cathedrals at the first sight of problems. I thought I would discover something if I followed her. Next time, I'll steal the cathedral in front of them." As he spoke, the other feeler of the ant moved as well. Hazel immediately forgot what she had just said and what she had just recalled. She had forgotten that she had met a postman wearing a monocle. She got off the carriage at the entrance of the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation and headed in with her maidservant in tow. Clearly, her maidservant and her driver didn't remember the previous order. In the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation, Audrey welcomed Hazel and brought her new friend into the activities needed to help the injured soldiers at the front lines. As the World German Sparrow had mentioned, that the leader of the secret order, Zeradal, and other angels were hidden in Buckland, Audrey carefully gave up on the third stage of treatment for Hazel. She hoped that Hazel wouldn't recall what she had experienced for the time being to prevent any accidents from happening. Her current plan was to busy herself with charity work, helping others, to make Hazel gradually brighten up and strengthen her ability to withstand the psychological trauma. In the Pirates' Free City, Furs was drinking a high concentration of fruit wine that was locally produced, recording what she had heard and encountered today. Suddenly, her spiritual perception was triggered as she instinctively looked to the side. She immediately saw a figure appear in the void, quickly reforming. It was German Sparrow in a half-top hat, black trench coat, and a cold expression. With a swoosh, Furs stood up with her wine glass and fountain pen. She subconsciously said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Sparrow." As she spoke, she hurriedly placed the items on the table. Klein pressed his top hat and looked around. "Do you want to leave?" Furs' eyes darted to her sides before she said, "All right." Over the past few days, she had already made preliminary records of the traits of the city that were different from other places. Without saying a word, Klein gestured at the items on the desk with his chin, indicating for Miss Magician to quickly pack up. Furs didn't hesitate at all as she hurriedly organized her drafts, as though she had heard an instruction. As he stood there and watched the other party busy, he suddenly said, "How's the progress with the horror story?" Furs trembled indiscernibly before replying, "Soon, soon." Klein gently nodded his head. "How much longer?" "A week, no, 5 days." "5 days, tops," Furs quickly replied. Klein didn't say anything else. After Furs packed up her drafts, fountain pen, half a bottle of wine, and other memorabilia, he took 2 steps forward and grabbed her shoulder. Countless indescribable figures flashed past, and Furs felt a little more relaxed than before. She even attempted to record this travel. Before long, she returned to Buckland and returned to the alley where she had disappeared from before. She heard the World German Sparrow say, "Rest for a few days before setting off. Take note of any replies. Also, ask your teacher again if there's any information related to the Blood Emperor tutor, mainly about the various ruins." "All right." Furs quickly agreed and thanked him. After separating from German Sparrow, she returned to a street in East Borough and entered an apartment that she shared with Zio. Zio put down the newspaper and looked at her friend. "Was it effective?" "Pretty good. I went to a free city belonging to the pirates this time, before Furs could finish speaking, her expression changed slightly. "Give me my coffee beans and cigarettes." "Why? Was it lacking there?" Xiao asked in puzzlement. Furs ran straight for the room inside and sat in front of the desk. She opened her drafts and picked up a pen. Without looking back, she said, "For the sake of the new book, remember to make me coffee." Xiao followed her to the bedroom door. When she heard that, she opened her mouth but didn't say anything. In another spot in East Borough, in a rented apartment with a similar layout. As Zeradal had already arrived in Backlund, it was unknown when Amon would be baited over. The Red Angel evil spirit's true motives were unknown, and he was planning on preventing George III from becoming a Black Emperor. On the one hand, Klein was trying his best to digest the Bizarro sorcerer potion, and on the other hand, he was making various preparations. At this moment, after handling the magician, he opened up a piece of paper and wrote, "Dear Mr. Azek, I've recently learned quite a bit of ancient history. I believe you will be very interested in it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have chosen to be a history teacher after losing your memories. This history involves some concealed secrets, so it's not convenient to describe them in a letter. When you wake up, I will share it with you in person. Also, I can create a charm called Yesterday Once More. Once used, you can find your past self through the historical void and borrow power from him. This is actually not something worth paying attention to. What's most important is that you can retrieve your memories from your past self. There's no need to use decades to slowly awaken them. I believe you will like it. I attached 2 with this letter. If you wake up, you can try their effects. I'm currently in an environment filled with undercurrents. If you come over, please be careful. Please observe the situation in advance. On the matter of George III advancing to a Black Emperor, I will try to do something, but the chances of success are very slim. Finally, I wish you well. I also wish that you wake up soon. Your eternal student, Klein Moretti." After folding the letter, Klein stuffed 2 Yesterday Once More charms into the envelope. Following that, he took out Azek's copper whistle and blew it. The huge skeleton messenger immediately emerged from the floor and received the letter with his head at a height lower than Klein. Klein nodded slightly and watched as the messenger disintegrated into bones before disappearing. After doing all of this, he used 2 fingers to pull out Wuxia paper crane from his wallet. He wrote on it with a pencil, "I have something to ask you." He placed the paper crane under his pillow and lay down on it. With the help of cogitation, he entered a deep sleep. In the depths of the pitch-black sharp tower, Klein once again met Wuxia, who was sitting in a black baby pram. Without waiting for the other party to speak, he directly asked, "Do you know who can provide the method needed to accommodate the uniqueness? What kind of price would it take? If the price is too high, then forget it." Klein added inwardly. Wuxia, who was sucking on his thumb, was taken aback. "You want to help me accommodate the die of probability?" Klein nodded seriously and said, "Regardless of whether it's a success or not, we should try our best." Just as he finished speaking, Wuxia's tears rolled down his cheeks. The chubby baby pounded his hands to the side and cried sadly. He whimpered and said, "It's useless. It's too late. I've already rebooted, and I still have to spend at least 22 years growing before I can accommodate the uniqueness. Why didn't you say that earlier? I'm really unlucky. It must have been that silly snake, Ouroboros, who took too much of my luck." Chapter 11:25 Opportunity. As he listened to Wuxia's tearful complaints, Klein was at a loss as to how to react. He could only remain expressionless. After the baby wrapped in silver silk calmed down, he asked in puzzlement, "Even if I said it earlier, it's useless. When I met you, you were already rebooted." "No, I was still Wuxia at that time." I didn't have series as my last name, I'd rebooted for a long time back then. The chubby baby wiped his tears and said, although I'm still quite some time away from becoming an adult, as long as I'm willing to take a certain risk, it's not impossible to accommodate it. With the luck I've accumulated, that risk can be resolved. But, the difference now is just too great. There's no way to make up for it. With a thought, Klein said after some deliberation, perhaps you can find an angel from the marauder pathway to steal time from you, allowing you to grow up faster. Xiaofan was still choking as he shook his head and said, it's useless. It's impossible for them to accurately steal my childhood and teenage years. If it's only a matter of time, it won't allow me to grow. It will only reduce the age I can originally live to. When the time comes, Xiaofan series will die prematurely, having been born June 1350 and dying October 1350, for a ripe old age of 4 months, but I've seen cases of aging rapidly due to the theft of time. Klein recalled what he had seen in Amon's mausoleum. The chubby baby still shook his head. No, that's just a manifestation of it being symbolized. If it's used on me, it will just be a baby that starts to grow wrinkles while his hair turns white. To truly accurately steal the childhood and teenage years, it has to be Amon, and it has to be his true body in person. At this point, the baby wrapped in silver silk and Klein fell silent at the same time. No one spoke for a long time. If he were to get Amon, the years that were possibly robbed wouldn't be limited to just the childhood and teenage years. After a while, Klein took a deep breath without hiding anything. Then there's no need to consider this for now. However, I still want to know where I can find a way to accommodate the uniqueness. If I have a chance to get it, I definitely can't miss it. Who knows when it might come in handy in the future. Xiaofan put down his tear-stained palm and sniffed. There's no need to ask others. I've already gotten it long ago, but I can't do it. Otherwise, do you think that me being president of the Life School of Thought was for nothing? Klein was surprised and curious. Why can't you do it? Xiaofan pulled the blanket in the baby's pram and said, there are 3 ways to accommodate the uniqueness. One is to be born naturally with it, which is equivalent to being a uniqueness coming to life and imbuing human nature into it. The other is to make the uniqueness come to life to a certain extent before forcefully putting it into one's body. By relying on the power of the Creator to suppress it, it will slowly take quite some time to slowly wear it down before one gets used to it and achieve a balance. The third is to concoct the uniqueness into an incomplete potion and drink it with a simplified apotheosis ritual. There's no need to mention the first method. This is why those brothers are enviable. The second is impossible after the ancient sun god's death. The third is the only viable option at the moment, but for the sequence 1 of the fate pathway, it depends on the machinations of fate. The first point was mentioned in Emperor Rosel's diary. It was said by Mr. Dorr. Does the second point mean that, after the ancient sun god wielded so many authorities, he was at least half a level higher than the present true deities, or even 1 full level? The Creator's level? As if in thought, Klein asked, what do you mean by only depending on the machinations of fate? What has this got to do with me saying earlier that I can help you accommodate the uniqueness? Xiaofan's chubby baby face revealed a look of poignancy. The apotheosis ritual for the fate pathway might be the simplest, or perhaps it's the most difficult. As long as we find the correct opportunity in the torrent of fate, we can directly consume the potion and attempt to advance. But the problem lies in the fact that the exact opportunity cannot be divined or predicted. There's no way to lock onto it. I can only eliminate certain interferences and patiently search as I experience life. I've already rebooted countless times and I've spent ages, but I still haven't encountered it. At this point, the baby's tears flowed down again. It sounds simple, but in fact, one can only rely on fate. It really depends on how well you look. With a sigh, Klein asked in enlightenment, when I said that I would help you accommodate the uniqueness, did you vaguely grasp that opportunity? The chubby baby cried even harder. Although I didn't really find it. I did sense it to a certain extent, is that so? Back then, when Wuxia came into contact with me, other than hoping to receive the help of yesterday once more, was it also pushed by luck? What a charlatan! Klein tersely acknowledged. Then there's no other way, you can only give me a few more of those charms. Wuxia nodded heavily. All right, replied Klein generously. He then added, you have to give me a few paper cranes. With that said, the baby wrapped in silver silk and Klein fell silent. In the rental apartment, after waking up from his dream, Klein got out of bed and walked to the room outside. He took out pen and paper and began to write to Leonard, I obtain charms that originate from high-sequence beyonders of the seer pathway. It allows someone to borrow power from their former selves. Klein didn't mention that it might be something his dear poet needed, as if he was simply describing it. After folding the letter, he took out a gold coin and a rectangular diamond-like charm and blew into the adventurer's harmonica. Rionette Tynker, who was wearing a dark and complicated long dress, walked out of the void with 4 blonde, reedied heads in hand. All eyes were cast towards the yesterday once more charm. The 4 heads spoke one after another, who, to deal with, this time, so direct. Klein sighed and smiled. It's unconfirmed yet. I'm going to attempt at foiling George Ill's plans. I might need your help at critical moments. The 4 heads in Rionette Tynker's hand spoke one after another, this, sounds, extremely, dangerous, requires, higher, payment, more of these charms? The comber of Klein's forehead twitched as though he had experienced the pain of tearing his soul apart. 3. Rionette Tynker's head, who had failed to join in the final sentence, shook. Klein smiled and answered, no problem, but it will take 1 to 2 weeks. Firstly, he had recently separated many worms of spirit and made quite a number of yesterday once more charms. It made him feel like he was nearing his limit and needed some rest. Secondly, he felt that it would be another 1 to 2 weeks before he could digest the Bizarro Sorcerer Potion and attempt to advance to Scholar of Your Once Miss Magician's new book was published. When the time came, he might have a simpler method. Rionette Tynker's 4 heads began to bob with the help of their hair, indicating that that wasn't a problem. Klein then pointed at the letter and gold coin. Send it to the mailbox at 7 Pinster Street. He had previously divined that Leonard wasn't at home. Apparently, he had gone south of the bridge. One of the heads of Rionette Tynker tilted up as she sucked the letter, gold coin, and yesterday once more charms into her mouth. As he watched Miss Messenger enter the void and vanish from his room, Klein pondered for nearly a minute before beginning to set up a sacrificial and bestowment ritual. Since the Bizarro Sorcerer Potion was about to be completely digested, there was no doubt that he had to prepare the various ingredients for Scholar of Your in advance. Among them, the demonic Wolf of Fog's transformed heart and white frost crystal could be obtained from the Evernight Goddess. And with the demonic wolf's transformed heart, he could go to the spirit world to bait a hound of Fulgrim. After a series of tasks, he finished setting up the altar and took 2 steps back to inspect the surroundings. It's still considered clean. In addition to the Wall of Spirituality's seal, it satisfies the requirements of a ritual. I haven't made any contribution recently, so how should I ask for a bestowment? Could it be that I'm telling the goddess that I plan to take a credit loan and pay it in installments? Will this be a little sacrilegious? I'll try to sacrifice something of value. If the goddess is willing to accept it, she will do the corresponding bestowment. Something of value. As he thought, his thoughts moved to the junk pile above the gray fog. He really wanted to pack up the items he couldn't sell for the time being, such as the biological poison bottle, the interrogator beyonder characteristic, lunatic beyonder characteristic, blatherer's aura, thousand-faced hunter's blood, 6-winged gargoyle's eyeball, spirit world plunderer powder, and other items to sacrifice to the goddess to exchange for the materials needed for Scholar of Your. However, he felt that this would make the goddess seem like a rag-and-bone man, hence, he could only give up the idea. It has to be of roughly the same value. I can't use Groselle's travels, it hides quite a bit of secrets. Perhaps it will be of great use. Yes, the next time little son and the others explore the giant king's court, I can give them Groselle's ashes. This time, I wasn't sure how far they could go in the expedition, and was worried that they were unable to return after entering the Groselle's travels. See God's scepter? That's even more important. Not only is it my most powerful sealed artifact, but it also involves the believers of the sea god. It will be my anchor for some time. When I have other things, more anchors, it can be given to Mr. Hanged Man. Vin Rambise's Beyonder characteristic. This has already been promised to Miss Justice. After some thought, he realized that he didn't have many choices left. One was Life's Cane, and the other was the Flaring Sun Charm, the Fate Siphon Charm, yesterday once more charms and control spirit bullets. The latter are all disposable items. Even if they're combined, their actual value wouldn't be comparable to the main ingredient of a Sequence 3 potion. Besides, once my ability to transfer wounds improves, it can take over a portion of the Life's Cane's effects. After hesitating for a while, he finally made a decision. Chapter 1126 Unexpected 1 After bringing the wood-colored cane back to the real world, Klein immediately began the ritual. He lit the candles and burned the corresponding essential oils and herbal powder, took 2 steps back, and skillfully recited the honorific name of the goddess. Finally, he said, I sacrifice this cane filled with life to you. I'm willing to receive your blessings. He didn't directly mention the demonic wolf of fog's transformed heart and white frost crystal. This was equivalent to making an equivalent exchange, not offering sacrificial items and praying for a bestowment. There was no need to be too meticulous in other aspects of the ritual, but this was a case of showing his attitude at a fundamental level. He felt that he needed to be careful. When Klein finished his sentence, 2 out of the 3 candle flames swelled and intertwined, forming an illusory and dark mysterious door. The door slowly opened, creating strong invisible winds. They swept up the Life's Cane, allowing it to disappear into the seemingly endless cosmos through the gap of the illusory door. Immediately following that, there was a flash as 2 items tore through the barrier and landed on the altar without making a single sound. One of them was a strange heart formed by wisps of white mist, and the other was crystalline frost that emitted cold air. Klein was delighted as he hurriedly lowered his head to thank the goddess for her bestowment. When he raised his head again, the dark and mysterious door had closed. It rapidly faded away, and the altar was completely restored to normal. Phew, it really succeeded. Klein heaved a sigh of relief and took 2 steps forward, putting away the demonic wolf of fog's transformed heart and white frost crystal. At this moment, the relaxed him couldn't help but have a thought that he absolutely couldn't say out loud. If I had known that it would go so smoothly, I wouldn't have had to use my Life's Cane. That huge junk pile might have been enough. Perhaps I didn't need to sacrifice anything, and the goddess would have bestowed them to me. The present situation indicates that she is personally supporting me becoming a scholar of yore. Of course, this way, if I receive too many bestowments, who knows what price I'll pay in the future. Using Life's Cane to trade for it makes me feel more at ease. Well, from the looks of it, before advancing to Sequence 2 and becoming an angel, the goddess will still shower her blessings on me. In the future, it will be hard to tell what kind of developments and changes will happen. With this in mind, he reined in his thoughts, ended the ritual, and tidied up the altar. Then, he began to plan on how to deal with the hounds of Fulgrim, the so-called Sapphira Castle Keepers. A magician never performs unprepared. South of the bridge, Rose Street. Leonard changed into a black and white police uniform and wore a red glove. He led his team members and the real policemen to the only cathedral of the Church of Earth Mother in Backland. The epaulets he was wearing corresponded to a high-ranking inspector. But in fact, with his status as a captain of a Red Gloves team, he should be equivalent to a superintendent or even a chief superintendent. However, officers at that rank wouldn't involve themselves in such missions. Wearing those epaulets to the Harvest Church would easily arouse the suspicion of the public. After passing through the door, Leonard scanned the area and realized that it was empty. There were only two figures. One was sitting in the front pew, focused on praying. The second was the handsome man dressed in a priest's robes. He had black hair and red eyes. Emlyn White. Leonard nodded secretly as he walked down the aisle to Bishop Yatravsky. He then coughed twice, making the half-giant bishop open his eyes and look over. "I'm an inspector from the Backlund Police Department." Leonard showed his identification and said, "We would like to invite you back to assist in our investigations." Father Yatravsky stood up slowly and asked in a calm tone despite looking down at him, "What's the matter?" "The nearby residents reported your abnormal behavior, saying that it's possible that you're a spy for Fasak or Fainapotter." Leonard explained the reason he had long come up with. At the same time, he was prepared to pull Bishop Yatravsky into a dream at any moment. Once he resisted, he would try to control this blessed in the shortest time possible. With the Red Gloves team's distribution, as long as they didn't directly encounter a true demigod, even if they were to face a blessed who was in charge of a holy artifact, they would have a good chance of taking down their opponent. Furthermore, before Leonard set off, he had applied for a Grade 1 sealed artifact. This was also the reason why he had delayed taking action until today. Father Yatravsky fell silent for 2 seconds before turning to look at Emlyn White, who was standing by the candle stand. Emlyn's slightly complicated expression froze. He opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say. Father Yatravsky retracted his gaze and nodded slightly. "Okay, so cooperative? I thought we would experience an intense battle and that we had to be very careful not to cause any casualties." Leonard was taken aback before he smiled. "Thank you for your cooperation." If there really was a battle that ended up harming a blessed of Earth Mother, Leonard suspected that the tense situation would rapidly be aggravated. Through the ancient history in Grozel's travels and the various secrets he learned from the Tarot Club, and the corresponding explanations of Old Man Palez, Leonard knew that the relationship between the Church of Earth Mother and the Church of Evernight was like dried timber. It could be ignited with a tiny spark. When the time came, the history books would record today's events. The war would go from a localized problem to a fuse that ignited the globe. Leonard Mitchell had lit a religious gunpowder keg. Phew. Seeing that Father Yatravsky didn't resist and accepted the protective custody, Emlyn White secretly heaved a sigh of relief. He was very satisfied with his performance at the Tarot Club. At this moment, the Red Gloves team member, Cindy, looked at Emlyn, who lacked a level of masculinity due to the gentleness of the soft moonlight. She lowered her voice and said, "Cap, sir, there's still a priest. Should we take him with us?" "Yes, we can temporarily shut down the Harvest Church for some time to prevent any accidents from happening." Emlyn, Leonard, after a few seconds and repeated deliberation, Leonard finally said, "If the spy case involves Fainapotter, he would also be considered a suspect. Let's invite him back to assist in our investigations." Emlyn was stunned, unsure of what expression to show in response. Eastborough, in a 2-bedroom rental apartment. Furs rubbed her dark eye circles and drank the last mouthful of bitter coffee. She stood up abruptly and began changing her clothes. "Done writing?" Zio, who was enjoying her breakfast, was taken aback. It had only been a day and a half. Furs shook her head and took a deep breath. "No, but I've already written the first volume. I can hand it over to the editor of the publisher. If it's serialized, there's no need to finish it all now." Zio thought and said, "This is indeed a good idea. It can effectively reduce your stress." Furz's expression twisted as she closed her eyes. I hope so. In another rental apartment a few streets away, after a series of tasks, Klein, who had come up with a plan and made his preparations, put on creeping hunger and quickly turned transparent as he entered the spirit world. Looking up, he saw the 7 pure lights that comprised of 7 different colors. He released the arms of his 2 marionettes and took out a box. He removed the wall of spirituality around it, allowing the aura of the demonic wolf of Fog's transformed heart to emanate from it. Then, he pulled a Nuni while a Nuni pulled Kona's. Together, the 3 of them rapidly teleported deep into the spirit world. Along the way, all kinds of strange spirit world creatures passed by them like oil paintings that depicted hell. After an unknown period of time, Klein's premonition for danger suddenly stirred as a scene quickly appeared in his mind: red, black, white, blue, and other colors saturated and overlapped as a slender figure suddenly appeared. It looked like a hound. Its entire body was covered in black short fur, and its eye sockets were 2 balls of dark red burning flames. The ends of its mouth extended to the back of its head. It clearly existed there in its corporal form, but it gave off an illusory feeling that felt surreal. Hound of Fulgrim. Klein immediately turned around and faced it. He released his 2 marionettes at the same time, allowing them to wander in different directions. In the blink of an eye, the Hound of Fulgrim appeared. The 2 dark red flames, which weren't too deformed but were absolutely terrifying, turned and looked at Klein. Right on the heels of that, its figure became more and more illusory. It instantly disappeared, as though it was a projection from history. It ran away just like that? As Klein muttered to himself in shock, he became even more wary of the possibility of a surprise attack. More than 10 seconds later, 2 figures phased into existence. They were covered in black fur, their eyes burning, and the corners of their lips extended to the back of their heads. However, there was only 1 dark red flame left in the eye sockets of each of the 2 monsters. The remaining fireballs were in their paws. Without waiting for Klein to react, the 2 hounds of Fulgrim lay down in the void of the spirit world and wagged their tails. They wagged their tails. Klein's mouth was agape, wondering if he was dreaming. Chapter 11:27 Sapphira Castle. Only after the 2 burning dark red fireballs floated over from the hounds of Fulgrim and landed in front of him did Klein snap back to his senses. He felt puzzled and relieved. Why did they harm themselves to come up with a pair of eyes for me? There seems to be thick and sticky blood surrounding them. If this is their trap, I would have already stepped into it. To think that I fell into a daze for a few seconds. This is a fatal mistake for a bizarro sorcerer in battle. However, no matter who it is, it's inevitable that they will have similar reactions when encountering something like this the first time. The terrifying enemy who they had meticulously planned to deal with had ended up kneeling down and wagging their tails the moment they see them. This is like a dream. This performance is very similar to Erodza's. Could the great existence above the spirit world be able to showcase special traits in the spirit world? As this thought flashed through his mind, he looked at the 2 dogs that were prostrating themselves in the void and wagging their tails. He stretched out his left hand and grabbed the 2 dark red flames and large amounts of thick, dark red blood. The moment he came into contact with these things, he suddenly heard familiar ravings and roars. They were sometimes shrill, sometimes dull, sometimes maniacal, sometimes seductive, sometimes crazy, and sometimes ethereal. Immediately following that, an illusory, grayish-white fog appeared in front of him. The fog spread out in all directions. Above them, there was a towering and majestic palace that looked like a god's residence. This was a very familiar scene, because every time he entered the mysterious space above the gray fog, he would pass through it. In the beginning, it was difficult for him to notice his surroundings after he took 4 steps counterclockwise. However, as he got used to it, and with the advancements of his sequence, he was able to easily take the opportunity to observe the phenomenon. And at that moment, Klein hadn't chanted the honorific name of celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, or taken 4 steps counterclockwise. This made him extremely wary. Then, he saw a few figures appear in the endless gray fog. They overlapped with the gray fog at times while separating at other times. They were none other than hounds of Fulgrim, with their eyes burning with dark red flames, and their bodies covered in short black fur. The 2 hounds of Fulgrim that had lost one eye each returned to their companion's side and blended into the dark spots in the gray fog. The entire phenomenon vanished as well. In the depths of the spirit world, Klein realized that there were no longer any hounds of Fulgrim around him. Only his 2 marionettes and strange spirit world creatures remained. Klein lowered his head and looked at the eyeballs and blood in his hand. With their presence, he confirmed that what he had just experienced was not an illusion. The hounds of Fulgrim are also known as Sapphira Castle Keepers. They live in the historical void. I saw them active within the gray fog before fusing with the dark spots. Combining what he had seen and heard, Klein gradually came to a bold conclusion: perhaps Sapphira Castle is referring to the mysterious space above the gray fog. It's referring to that strange door of light. As for the gray fog, it's a symbolic object formed from all the history in the spirit world. There are void gaps present in it. Every time I enter the mysterious space through the gray fog, I leave certain traces there, making the hounds of Fulgrim no longer feel unfamiliar with me. They see me as the owner of Sapphira Castle, so when they saw me, they immediately offered me what I needed and shook their tails to gain my favor. After a day of planning, asking about the situation, and inviting helpers, I ended up targeting my own guards. As he thought of this, he inexplicably felt a sense of absurdity at the situation. It felt like the fool above the gray fog was reaching out his hands to fleece someone, only to end up fleecing himself. Phew. Sapphira Castle. Although this development makes me even more afraid, in any case, I still have some understanding of the owner of the gray fog and that mysterious space. The unknown is the most terrifying thing. After standing silently in the depths of the spirit world for a moment, Klein slowly exhaled and summoned his 2 marionettes back. He planned on waiting for the Bizarro Sorcerer potion to be completely digested before attempting to seek out relevant knowledge about Sapphira Castle from Rhodes and other places. When the time came, if anything were to happen, he could use his advancement to fight it. East Borough, in a 2-bedroom rental apartment. With her dark eye circles, Furs returned and retrieved the day's newspaper and letters in passing. How was it? Zio, who had just returned home for lunch, asked. Furs covered her mouth and yawned. Not bad. The editor I know is very satisfied with my new book's topic and writing style. He decided to arrange for its serialization as soon as possible. You might not be aware, but the horror stories of Baklan's hospitals have been very popular recently. A best-selling author had gained inspiration from it and is beginning to serialize similar stories. I'm actually not the first to do so. This is a good thing. Zio thought about it and nodded seriously. This meant that Furs, who had also written the horror stories of Baklan's hospitals, wouldn't attract too much attention. Her new pen name wouldn't be tested either. I know. Furs threw the newspaper aside and took out a few letters that were stuffed in it before quickly flipping through them. Soon, she found the reply letter from her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham. Furs's expression immediately turned solemn as she quickly tore open the envelope. She spread open the letter and began reading. Benjamin Abraham is from Intis. He lived in Roselle's era. Apart from mysticism knowledge and a small amount of inheritance, he didn't leave anything of value behind. Later on, everything was destroyed by the Aurora Order. I'm unable to provide the corresponding information. Mr. Gehrman Sparrow is about to be disappointed. Furs pursed her lips and pulled off a magic trick, burning the letter in her hand to ashes. Then, she began writing a reply, asking her teacher if she knew of the secret ruins of Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. Klein went above the gray fog and listened to Miss Magician's prayers. The trail of clues for Benjamin Abraham have come to an end. It's all the fault of those lunatics from the Aurora Order. At the same time, he learned of the serialization of the horror stories of Backlund's hospitals. After returning to the real world, and just as he was about to head out for a meal, he suddenly saw Miss Messenger walk out of the void with 4 heads in her hand. One of them had a letter in its mouth. "Who sent it?" asked Klein in puzzlement. Rionette Tinker's remaining 3 heads replied, "Seduced, idiot, who is that?" Klein grew confused as he took the letter and opened it. The mastermind behind those matters is George III. His goal is to become the Black Emperor. Are you interested in stopping this matter? Trissy. This demoness actually dares to write me a letter. Isn't she afraid of being caught by Miss Messenger on the spot? Oh right, Miss Messenger just said that the sender was a seduced idiot. Trissy seduced a man and got him to help her summon the messenger while she hid far away and waited for the other party to contact her through a mirror? She's pretty smart. She really is very persistent in investigating this matter. Isn't she afraid that she'll be killed by either me or George III? That man should be a beyonder. It would be quite difficult for an ordinary person to hold a summoning ritual. After all, it relies on one's spirit and spirituality. Klein was first puzzled before he came to a realization. Immediately following that, he began to wonder why Trissy managed to guess that George III wanted to become the Black Emperor. Without sufficient mysticism knowledge, and without knowing the Black Emperor's apotheosis ritual or the corresponding history, even a demigod would find it difficult to guess. It definitely wasn't as easy as the Red Angel evil spirit had said. Could it be that Trissy has other helpers? Or could it be that she has obtained more power from the primordial demoness, including all sorts of knowledge and secrets? Klein frowned slightly as he felt that there was something amiss. If there was a chance, he would definitely get rid of demoness Trissy. After thinking for more than 10 seconds, he took out a piece of paper and pen from his pocket and scribbled a reply, "I'm interested, but I don't know what you want to do." In the Backlund Bridge area, a man in his 30s looked in horror as the headless woman, no, the 4-headed demoness reappeared before him and dropped a letter. Are all the messengers in the mysterious world so terrifying? Only about 5 minutes after Rionette Tinker left did the man catch his breath. He picked up the letter and opened it to take a look. During this process, his gaze gradually burned because it meant that he could meet that beautiful woman again. According to her instructions, he waited until the evening before he took out the black sticky lump. He separated them and applied them evenly onto a mirror. A few seconds later, the mirror turned dark, as if it was connected to another world. In the blink of an eye, the mirror presented a room that was completely different from the present environment. There was a young girl dressed in a dark black dress. She was none other than demoness Trissy. The man who finished the ritual immediately revealed an infatuated expression as he subconsciously whispered, the reply said that he _ interested. The light dimples on the sides of Trissy's cheeks slowly bloomed, making the mirror appear brighter. Her eyebrows relaxed as she said, "I'll send you a letter. Forward it to Gehrman Sparrow. You absolutely cannot read its contents." After obtaining the man's unhesitant promise, Trissy stretched out her right hand and swiped it across the mirror, causing the dark aqueous light to disappear. She immediately found pen and paper and deliberated for a few seconds before quickly writing, "The secret mausoleums needed for the George Il's ritual should be from Blood Emperor Lista Tutor, and there is in existence who understands it very well. It might be able to help us successfully infiltrate and cause damage during the ritual. I have a way to contact that existence, but we have to wait until the next full moon. What you need to do is provide me with some blood, hair, flesh, or bones from a descendant of the Abraham family. Trissy." Chapter 1128 Finally an outcome East Borough, in a 2-bedroom rental apartment. After receiving the reply from Demonis Trissy from Miss Messenger Rionette Tynker, he pulled a chair to sit down and began reading. This means she knows of Mr. Door's existence, and she has a way to use the bloodline of the Abraham family to communicate with that entity. Trissy can already withstand Mr. Door's cry for help. Isn't she afraid of losing control because of this? Besides, she seems to be very sure of Mr. Door's identity. She really has obtained more knowledge and secrets from the primordial Demonis. But in such a situation, why would the Demonis of White Katarina be pursuing her? Questions arose in Katarina's mind as he read the short letter. As Trissy's vague mention of the matter was within his understanding, he believed that she wasn't lying in this aspect. Furthermore, she had provided a very feasible solution. Of course, the prerequisite for this method to succeed was to obtain the correct ritual and have a descendant of the Abraham family be willing to take a huge risk, as they used something related to their bloodline as a medium. Of these 3 points, he was missing the first point. He still had some doubts about the third point. He attempted to find a safer and more concealed method, but Demonis Trissy seemed to only lack the second point. To me, it's easy to find the descendants of the Abraham family. I can directly contact them through Miss Magician. However, once I hand over their hair, blood, flesh, and bones to Demonis Trissy, this will put them at risk of being hexed. Klein understood the Demonis pathway rather well and knew that they were very good at hexes. As his thoughts raced, he gradually came up with a countermeasure. It was to use the hair, flesh, or bones of the deceased. He remembered that Miss Magician had mentioned to the fool that she had once buried an old man named Lawrence. He was undoubtedly a descendant of the Abraham family. I hope it wasn't a cremation. Although this is somewhat sacrilegious to a corpse, speaking to Mr. Door is a necessary procedure to dispel the Abraham family's ancient curse. It's better to use the dead rather than implicate the living. When the time comes, I'll add this in Trissy's reply. I'll claim that this is a requirement stipulated by the descendant of the Abraham family for the ritual's medium. Also, I have to first confirm that Trissy is going to speak to Mr. Door, and not attempt to pull him back to the real world. They are either of a high level or are involved in high-level situations. It will be difficult to obtain any effective revelations using divination, but Emperor Roselle said that the ritual required to facilitate Mr. Door's return is very complicated. It definitely can't be set up by a small number of descendants. I can get Queen Mystic and Miss Sharon to monitor Backlund's underground market and see if there are any abnormal trades of materials and personnel. Klein nodded slightly and decided to find Miss Magician in a while. He could also rush her writing. Northborough, Phelps Street. On a bench, a young man in a black trench coat and silk top hat was sitting there with a thin face and a broad forehead. He looked at the withered and yellow Intis parasol trees in a daze. He wore a crystal-carved monocle on his right eye, looking rather refined. At that moment, an elder who was heading to St. Samuel Cathedral stopped in his tracks when he saw that something was amiss. He asked gently, "Young man, what are you worried about? You lost something in this war?" He suspected that the young man's relatives, lover, or friends had died in the air raid or during intense battles at the front lines. That was why he was sitting alone by the side of the street, looking lost. The young man raised his hand and pinched his monocle. He sighed and shook his head. "I'm just thinking about some rather complicated questions." "Are you a philosopher?" The old man was taken aback as he blurted out. "No, but I often bring up philosophical problems for others, just like who I am, where I am, and what's my future." The young man smiled calmly as he continued to ponder. From time to time, he would purse his lips and whisper silently. The elder couldn't understand him and could only shake his head. Under the gaze of the stray dogs, sparrows, ants, and microbes in the air, he slowly left. The young man didn't turn his head. His monocle reflected yellow leaves that were floating down as he muttered to himself, "To parasite, to not parasite, to not parasite. See the bait, devour the bait, see the bait, devour the bait. After getting the hair from Lawrence's remains from furs, and seeing the horror stories of Backland hospitals being serialized in the Tussock Times, Klein entered a patient state. He also promised to send Miss Magician to a new place next week to record new sights and customs. Soon, a new week had arrived. After having his lunch, he planned to take a short nap to prepare for the 3 o'clock tarot gathering. At this moment, Rionette Tynker, who was holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads, walked out from the depths of the void. One of them had a linen bag in its mouth. Who sent it? Klein suddenly had an inexplicable feeling. He had a complicated premonition as he didn't immediately reach out to receive the bag Miss Messenger was holding. Rionette Tynker's 3 free heads spoke one after another, the real, mutated, king of mushrooms, this string of words. I roughly understand what's going on. Klein controlled his expression of not baring his teeth as he slowly took the bag. When he opened the bag, he wasn't surprised to see copious amounts of demons, no, mushrooms. Some of them were white and full, as though they would spurt out milk with a single poke. Some of them were black at the bottom and were embedded with thin blood-colored lines and markings. Some of them were covered in golden stars, and the mushroom cap was as large as a palm. At that moment, the mushrooms were still squirming slightly, as though they wanted to spread their hyphae and spores. After swallowing his saliva, he picked up a letter that was surrounded by mushrooms, and he started reading, "My dear friend, Gehrman, I've finally completed your request. I've invented mushrooms that can be planted in dark and harsh environments. They can grow by devouring the flesh and blood of monsters, without any other conditions. Their descendants will be divided into 2 categories. The first type will accumulate various kinds of poisons that cannot be eaten. However, they can be used as a source of poison. The other type can be used for food after being cooked at high temperatures through boiling, stewing, and frying. You must remember not to eat it raw or before it's cooked. Otherwise, they will proliferate in your body, using your flesh and blood as a hotbed. In consideration of having a variety of flavors, I've invented 11 kinds of mushrooms. Some are rich in milk. This can be directly drunk. Some are like beef. When frying them, there's no need to provide any extra oil. Some are as delicate as fish meat but without the bones. My suggestion is to roast or boil it. All of these wouldn't have been possible without your help. If I hadn't already advanced and become a druid, I might have taken a few years, or even more than a decade to resolve all the problems I encountered during the experimentation process. If you have any other ideas that are suitable for me, please share them with me. Your friend forever, Frank Lee." With the letter in hand, Klein fell silent for a long time. He looked up and realized that Miss Messenger was still waiting. He sighed silently and walked to the desk. He took out a piece of paper and a pen and slowly wrote, "I'm very happy that you've succeeded. These mushrooms will help me greatly. They will effectively reduce famine in certain areas. I'm currently busy with some matters, so I don't have any new ideas for now. Your friend, Gehrman Sparrow." After folding the letter, he looked at Miss Messenger and hesitantly asked, "How's Frank Lee's condition like now?" The head that Rionette Tynker had previously failed to say anything spoke first, excited. The other 3 added, animated, happy, satisfied. Following that, the 4 heads said, "No longer afraid of being buried in soil." "Why?" Klein subconsciously asked. The 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in Rionette Tynker's hand spat out word by word, "He can extract the soil's nutrients and oxygen. Frank has really evolved quite a bit after becoming a druid." For a moment, Klein wasn't sure if he should be happy for his friend, or if he should grieve for the crew of the future. As he watched Miss Messenger leave, Klein forced himself to sleep through cogitation. Then, he woke up at 2:30 p.m. to prepare for this week's tarot gathering. At 3 o'clock, dark red beams of light rose up from the ancient palace above the grey fog and solidified into their corresponding figures. Audrey immediately stood up, curtsied, and bowed towards the end of the long bronze table. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." As a senior psychiatrist, she had great control over her emotions. Furthermore, she hadn't encountered any problems this week. She was mainly seeking out donations, contacting pharmaceutical factories, and organizing medical volunteers. However, compared to the past, the cheerfulness and happiness she had when making her greeting had decreased significantly. The Fool Klein nodded slightly in response to the greetings from the members of the Tarot Club. Following that, he cast his gaze at the hermit. He still owed this lady 8 questions. Katlia bowed her head and said with an unfaultable attitude, "Honorable Mr. Fool, there are still 2 questions this time." After obtaining approval, she continued, "The first question is, what is the state of the devils in the abyss?" Queen Mystic's first suspicion is that the Emperor's mausoleum is hidden in the abyss. This is identical to the Emperor's train of thought. She is indeed his biological daughter. Unfortunately, there are no citizens that can be controlled there. The Fool Klein muttered to himself inwardly as he answered with an unchanging expression, "The current abyss is a place most devils are unable to live in." Chapter 1129 Pressure. The current abyss is a place most devils are unable to live in. Upon hearing Mr. Fool's reply, Katlia and company inevitably felt a deep sense of shock. In mysticism, the abyss was considered by all to be the most corrupted and most disorderly place. It was where the devils lived. But now, most of the natives were unable to survive in there. Is the environment in the abyss worsening, causing the devils to be unable to adapt to it, or is it because the situation regarding the corruption, chaos, and degeneration has improved, making the abyss no longer suitable for the devils to live in? Alger quickly had 2 theories, but he didn't know which one it was. The hermit Katlia shared the same thoughts as him, but she was even more puzzled as to why the queen would ask such a question. Regarding Mr. Fool's answer, it seemed to have a deeper meaning to it, one that could help the queens in understanding whatever agenda she had, and its secrets. As for justice, she suddenly thought of the Church of Knowledge's prophet demigod. He had once said that the end of the world would arrive in 1368 of the 5th epoch. This was publicly acknowledged by all beyonders who were good at making prophecies. Even the deities had agreed with it. It's 1350 this year, we're only 18 years from the apocalypse. Hence, there are signs of the abyss appearing. The chaotic and degenerate environment that is originally filled with abstract meanings has broken past its limits, becoming even worse. Audrey had a rough idea of the situation, and this added to her slight anxiety and unease. As there weren't any signs of the apocalypse in the beginning, she didn't put much weight on the matter. She usually paid more attention to the current wars, casualties, and the victims of suffering. But now, the anomaly within the abyss had left her inexplicably horrified. She desperately wanted to improve herself. She wanted to finish digesting the potion and obtain the Beyonder characteristic left behind by Vin Rambus to advance to become a demigod. Only then could she have the ability to interfere and resist certain things that she didn't want to see happen. Mr. World, entrust me with more tasks. Audrey silently prayed in her heart and secretly placated her restless emotions. The members such as Leonard, Furs, and Zio actually had some doubts about whether the abyss really existed. This was because, after the 2nd epoch, the abyss had never revealed itself to the world again. The most active devils in the real world had come from the Blood Sanctify sect. Even the high-level devils and evil existences that the rituals pointed to were highly likely to be the highest echelons of the Blood Sanctify sect. Of course, the evil god, the dark side of the universe, was widely regarded as the embodiment of the abyss, but his presence was extremely low. If he hadn't occasionally responded to the ritual and showed the characteristics of the devil, he would probably be considered a pure legend, just like giant King Ormer. But even so, the secrets of the Church of Evernight that Leonard could come into contact with had also shown that it was possible that the dark side of the universe was a disguise used by other evil gods and hidden existences. This wasn't surprising to Derek. In certain places some distance away from the City of Silver, deep in the endless darkness, there were many devils that were unable to maintain their calm states. There was no lack of demigods like the demons that weren't too different from the abyss. If not for the fact that the giant king's court and other iconic items existed, the City of Silver citizens would definitely have suspected that the truth behind them being abandoned was that they had been thrown into the abyss. As the thoughts flashed through the members' minds, Katlia restrained her doubts and continued asking, "Honorable Mr. Fool, the second question is, did the things that Emperor Roselle do in his later years have any external, unnecessary influence?" This question reminded Klein of the shocking details in Roselle's later diary entries. Immediately, he sighed. With the posture of the fool, he slowly shook his head. No. Those things were what the Emperor wanted to do. Just as Katlia felt an uncontrollable sense of disappointment and sadness when she heard Mr. Fool smile with a sigh. It wasn't due to an external influence or influencer, but due to corruption. It's very difficult to detect, even for him. Corruption. Emperor Roselle was corrupted in his later years? At that time, he was already, a grounded angel. How could he be corrupted? Is this from a particular true god or the underground corruption that even the ancient gods feared? Amidst the shock, Audrey came up with a guess based on the secrets she knew. Alger and the other members of the Tarot Club also didn't expect such a thing to happen to Emperor Roselle in his later years. They began to suspect his purpose behind him creating the cards of blasphemy. At the same time, they believed that Mr. Fool's search of the cards of blasphemy might contain deeper motives, much more than what they had originally deduced. In this game that involves the entire world, only important figures like Mr. Fool have the right to become a player. And we are only a card or some chips. The kings of angels and sequence 1 angels might be qualified to participate. Alger sighed as he had the desire to become a player. The story of the Emperor's later years went from being a tyrant to an evil god? A book that starts off with romance, motivation, passion, love, adventure, and even the decadent lifestyle of Intis high society later turns into a horror story? I wouldn't even dare write something like that. If it were me writing it, I would make the Emperor's final tragic end stem from a betrayal in one's love, a marriage betrayal, or betraying an oath. Furs couldn't help but let her thoughts go wild. She even had the urge to start writing a set of chronicles for Emperor Roselle. Of course, there were quite a number of Roselle's chronicles on the market. Some of them were even prohibited items. Corrupted. So it's because of corruption. Katlia sighed and felt sorrowful. She sighed with emotion. In the end, the Emperor didn't end up like the story of the dragon-slaying warrior he had spoken of. From being a hero, he turned into an evil dragon. He was still a legend worthy of worship, but the sad thing was that, up to today, this misunderstanding was finally beginning to be resolved. After her emotions settled down, Katlia recalled the matter of being corrupted. The more she thought about it, the more horrified she became. She believed that she was one of the members of the Tarot Club who knew Roselle the best. She knew very well what height this Emperor had reached in his later years. Of course, Mr. Fool was the convener, a witness, and not a member. However, a sequence 1 angel such as him, someone who made the throne of divinity a target, had been silently corrupted. He and the people around him didn't notice it at all. This is much more terrifying than it is horrific. Katlia secretly took a deep breath before slowly exhaling to regulate her emotions. Then, she bowed towards the end of the long, model table. "Thank you for your answer, Honorable Mr. Fool. I'm also thankful that you didn't ask anything beyond my means." The Fool Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he leaned back into his chair and nodded slightly. "You may begin." Just like the previous gathering, the members of the Tarot Club had either just advanced or were still digesting. They didn't have any trades to do, and they didn't need anything for the time being. After exchanging a few looks, they decided to directly enter the free exchange segment. Of course, Emlyn was a special exception. He really wanted to make a request to get someone to start a jailbreak to free him from the basement of St. Samuel Cathedral. Yes, to this day, he was still under protective custody behind Cheney's Gate at the Backland headquarters of the Church of Evernight. In his neighboring cell was Bishop Yatravsky, and during this period of time, no Nighthawk had come to interrogate him. If not for the people in charge of guarding the sealed area bringing them water and food every day, Emlyn definitely would have believed that he and Father Yatravsky had already been forgotten. The dark, silent environment is still all right, but it's just a little cold. But without dolls, newspapers, books, and historical documents, this life is meaningless. Besides, the Nighthawks provide me with cow blood, and it tastes nasty. The effects aren't too good either. I'm already becoming weak. Emlyn opened his mouth, but he didn't say a word because he felt that this was a very embarrassing matter. After all, he was the one who asked the star and had pushed for protective custody. Yet, he ended up also being brought into protective custody. I hope that fellow hasn't forgotten me and is thinking of a way to get me out. Emlyn glanced at the star Leonard and maintained his silence. Leonard maintained his posture and didn't respond to the moon's gaze. There was nothing he could do for the time being. This was because he was the one who had raised the term protective custody in front of the Archbishop. As for Emlyn White, he was a vampire viscount, equivalent to a Sequence 5 Beyonder. He was a mobile humanoid bomb that also believed in the Earth Mother. There was no reason for him to be released immediately. I can only wait for the Sanguine to protest through other channels before I have the authority to handle this matter. The star Leonard decided to apply for a private exchange later and get Emlyn to think of a way to get the upper echelons of the Sanguine to contact the Church of Evemite. Their interaction had been noticed by Justice. She immediately thought of the question Mr. Moon had asked her last time. She suspected that something had gone wrong during the protective custody operation, but it didn't seem too serious. I heard that the priest of the Harvest Church saved quite a number of people during the Great Smog of Backland. I hope nothing bad happens. Audrey nodded slightly and cast her gaze at Little Sunday. The other members of the Tarot Club also cast their gaze towards the son Derek. They knew that the City of Silver had planned on exploring the Giant King's Court last week, so it was likely that the results were out. The son Derek sat up straight and glanced at Mr. Hanged Man before saying in a very natural manner, "We've completed our first exploration of the Giant King's Court. 3 dead, 1 missing, 5 survivors. We first arrived at the front door of the King's Court and saw 2 silver knights in an unknown state standing guard there. This is the name of the Giant Pathways Sequence 3. Chapter 1130 News Storm 2 Sequence 3 Demigods were guarding the main door. As expected of the Giant King's Court. The divine kingdom of an ancient god. The members of the Tarot Club suddenly felt a similar feeling. As for the son Derek, he didn't pause as he continued his recount. To him, he was shocked when he first discovered the 2 silver knights guarding the main door of the Giant King's Court. However, the series of events that followed made it seem extremely ordinary, making it difficult to stir up his emotions. According to what Mr. World shared, we followed a rather hidden path to the back of the Giant King's Court. The monsters we encountered were mainly wraiths. They were restrained by the unshadowed crucifix. After we arrived at the Waning Forest, we tried to explore it, and we discovered that the remnants of the Giant King's will and the Divine Kingdom's powers had formed an evil spirit. It was protecting its parents' mausoleum. Derek skillfully recalled his experiences during the expedition, and the members of the Tarot Club, Audrey, Alger, and the others, quickly reined in their thoughts of the Silver Knight Guards and listened attentively. They were all very interested in the secret hidden in the Waning Forest. They wanted to know what the ancient god, the Giant King, had tried to keep from his queen and child. Thinking back to the scene he had seen, Derek paused for a moment before saying, after purging that evil spirit, we came to the mausoleum of the giant king's parents. There was a stone stele erected there, indicating the identity of the tomb's owner. As for the tomb and coffin, it had long been opened by someone, revealing the corpses inside. They were the corpses of two humans, corpses of humans? The tomb of the giant king's parents had corpses of humans buried in it? Godfather and godmother? No, there wasn't any religion back then. As a demigod who knew plenty of mysteries, the hermit Catlia's first reaction was that the two corpses had another identity. Immediately following that, she recalled what the queen had mentioned. It was a question that Emperor Roselle had asked as though he had been talking to himself when he was alive. Why did the ancient documents and historical records refer to giants, elves, vampires as humanoid creatures or anthropoid creatures? Why didn't they refer humans as giant-like, elf-like, or vampire-like creatures? Could it be that all humanoid creatures had descended from humans? The giants, elves, and vampires were the mutations brought by the Beyonder characteristics that could eventually become inherited? Catlia instantly calmed her emotions as she seriously considered the possible reasons. At this moment, she felt that her potion would be digested to a certain degree once she returned to the real world. This was because the sequence 4 of the mystery prior pathway was called Mysticologist, and the origins of the giants and humanoid creatures were without a doubt of extremely great value. They were mysticism knowledge that most ordinary demigods had no way of knowing. The giant king's parents were humans? That must be fake. Alger immediately suspected that someone had fabricated the scene. However, on second thought, this act not only required the real remains to be taken away and replaced with human remains, but one had to prepare a suitable coffin to make the tomb look like it didn't belong to a giant. Furthermore, fabricating it was pointless and wouldn't affect reality too much. Alger felt that no one would be so bored as to do something like that. To be able to enter the giant king's court and suppress a powerful evil spirit, the person that approached the two graves was at least a saint, meaning that they had long passed the age of pulling pranks. Could it be that the ancestors of all creatures were humans? This includes the elves. As he had seen too many shocking things at the Tarot Club, as well as suffer a religious breakdown from the mural on that primitive island, Alger didn't have overly intense emotions run through him. He just couldn't help but raise his hand and touch his dark blue hair. Mr. Hanged Man connected himself to this matter. The giant king's parents are actually humans. From the looks of it, most of the creation myths are fake. They were all fabricated by future generations. However, there are also hidden meanings in them. Mr. Moon seems to find it unacceptable. Mr. World seems to have known about it long ago. With the help of placate and other psychological techniques, Audrey was able to compose herself the fastest, and she instinctively observed the reactions of the other members. At that moment, Emlyn was the most restless. His mind was filled with thoughts of impossible and it's impossible. If the original ancestor of giants were human, then what about the sanguine? Could it be that we were just monsters that had mutated because of Beyonder characteristics? Impossible. We were clearly created by the ancestor. She has the authority of life and creation. It's completely different from the barbaric deities like the giant king and elf king who only knew how to fight. As Emlyn's thoughts churned, he felt a baffling feeling that his pride was cracking apart. His intuition, his rationality, and brain told him that the son Derek didn't have any reason to lie about this matter. The possibility of other existences fabricating the scene was also very low. Hence, he subconsciously expelled the giant and elves from the ranks of humanoid creatures, and he viewed them as a branch of humanity. Leonard, Furs, and Zio quickly accepted the possibility that the son revealed. To them, regardless of whether the giant ancestor was giant or human, or even a curly-haired baboon, it was no big deal. At most, it just meant that many supernatural creatures were a result of Beyonder characteristics in the bodies of ordinary creatures, but this didn't cause any meaningful changes to their concept of reality. The son Derek calmed himself down and continued in the strange silence. After leaving the waning forest, we entered the giant king's court through the barren tunnel. On the way, there were remnant powers of corruption and concealment. We had to make the correct response in order to pass. That palace contains a mural that possesses powers related to the cycle of fate. As such, we were affected and transformed into the people who participated in a gathering. We repeated a very short process, and this process was the establishment of Rose Redemption. At this point, Derek looked around and saw that all the members had temporarily jolted out of their previous states. They were extremely interested in the organization called Rose Redemption. They all knew that this was an extremely secretive and ancient organization that followed and believed in the true creator. It was the origins of the Aurora Order, and its members were kings of angels like Ouroboros, Medici, and Sasrer. Derek retracted his gaze and exhaled silently. The two people who convened the Rose Redemption are Dark Angel Sasrer and Evernight Goddess Ammonizes. Audrey, Leonard, and Zio began to doubt their ears. They were all believers of Evernight. They never expected that the goddess would be a member of Rose Redemption, and even be one of its conveners. This was akin to saying that the Evernight goddess was a member of the Tarot Club. If not for the fact that they knew what kind of person Little Sun was, knowing that he wouldn't lie, they definitely would have suspected the truth of this matter. But now, they were left temporarily speechless. They didn't even dare to think too deeply about it. Alger subconsciously turned his body to look at the sun, listening to his slow and heavy tone. The participants included White Angel Aucases, Wind Angel Leodoro. Alger's eyelids twitched. He didn't even dare think. God of Combat Badhile, Earth Mother Omabella, Emlyn, who was leaning against the back of the chair, unknowingly sat up straight. There was only one message echoing in his mind: the goddess of harvest, Giant Queen Omabella. God of the dead Salinger, God of spiritual creatures Tolsna. The son Derek's voice echoed in the ancient and magnificent palace. It made Katlia, Furs, and the other members exchange looks. No one dared to say a word. It was as though they would suffer from divine punishment if they learned any deeper. After Derek finished speaking, they remained silent. The scene was strangely quiet. Finally, Katlia sighed and said, "Rose Redemption truly is powerful and terrifying. Before this, I couldn't even imagine that those existences were members." Just as she said that, the World Gehrman Sparrow said with a deep, hoarse voice, that was an organization formed to resist the ancient sun god. Later on, only a few kings of angels remained. Upon hearing their conversation, it was as if Audrey and the other members had just snapped out of their dreams. All of them subconsciously cast their gaze to the end of the long, mottled table, at the figure shrouded in gray fog. It was as though they were waiting for the ruling of the entity of authority there. The fool Klein, who had long expected such a scene, didn't respond directly. He nodded slightly and sighed. The fallen creator was born because of this. It's real. It's real. The Rose Redemption which Mr. Fool hinted back then actually has such a deeper meaning. What is his identity in ancient times, and what position does he take in this matter? All these thoughts instantly formed a storm that swept through the minds of the Tarot Club members. Derek looked at everyone, and seeing that no one was speaking, he could only talk about the subsequent exploration. We met the leader of the King's Court's chasers outside the palace, Light Color Merskogan. He said that Dark Angel Sasrer was in a state of slumber in that palace. Compared to the matter regarding Rose Redemption, news of the mysterious Dark Angel currently in slumber inside the Giant King's palace didn't stir up the emotions of Leonard, Emlyn, and the other members of the Tarot Club much. Only some of their curiosities had been satisfied. Of course, as a mysticologist, Katlia only hoped that the sun could speak a little more. After that, we returned. Mr. Fool has bestowed us with the formula for the Silver Night Potion. Towards the end of his explanation, Derek concluded honestly. Audrey and the others were still deep in thought over what had just happened. There was still a fear of being blasphemous, and no one responded. Only Alger thought for a moment and said, since the birth of the true creator originated from Ro's redemption, then he isn't unfamiliar with what happened to the giant king's court. Why is it that Shepherd Elder Lovia was completely unprepared for this? Chapter 1131 An indescribable transaction. This is also a question I wanted to ask. The fool Klein, who was seated at the end of the long, model table, echoed Mr. Hanged Man in his heart. Leonard thought for a moment and tried to find a possible reason. Although the birth of the true creator originates from Ro's redemption, it doesn't mean that he knows everything about Ro's redemption. Perhaps figuring out the truth back then is one of his motives. Just as he said that, Justice Audrey objected, the angel of fate, Ouroboros, who was drawing that mural, is still in Ro's redemption and follows the true creator. If one had any questions, he could have just asked him directly. Perhaps the true creator's goal is to confirm Dark Angel Sasrar's condition. From Shepherd Lovia's strong desire to enter the palace of the giant king, we can preliminarily determine that. Katlia gave her own opinion. I share similar thoughts. Alger glanced at the sun and said, of course, we can't eliminate the possibility that the star suggested. Perhaps the angel of fate Ouroboros's condition isn't right, and he has lost most of his memories. One can only rely on the murals he left behind in the past to find his lost past. The odds are very low, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. We aren't aware of what's special or problematic with the kings of angels. As he spoke, Alger glanced at Mr. Fool, as if hoping to get some hints from this existence. Unfortunately, he failed to get any feedback. It wasn't that the fool Klein didn't have any ideas, but that he had too many ideas and was unable to list them out. Tail Devourer Ouroboros grows up by the true creator's side every time he reboots. No one knows what his current state is. After muttering in his heart and seeing that no one had any more ideas, Klein controlled the world to look at the sun. I recently obtained a batch of mushrooms that can be grown in the darkness when feeding them the flesh of monsters. I wonder if your city of silver is interested? Mushrooms that can devour the flesh and blood of monsters? Zio and company were surprised and curious. They didn't know how such a creature could exist. Indeed, there are many things in the world that we have yet to understand. This is what a scribe should record down. Furs sighed and came to a realization. Katlia's eyes suddenly darkened. She sat there without saying a word or moving, like a statue. Upon hearing this, Derek was delighted. His thoughts raced as he blurted out, "Can those mushrooms automatically attack monsters?" If that was possible, then they could be used as food and also be used as the perimeter defense system for the City of Silver. I thought Little Sun would be afraid of those mushrooms. In the end, his request is even more excessive. The world's mouth twitched slightly. No, if the mushrooms can automatically attack monsters, it will be no exception for any of you. Derek immediately felt a little ashamed as he hurriedly nodded. I understand, Mr. World. Following that, he let the fake world make a further description. Some of those mushrooms can be ground into flour, others can produce milk or are rich in oil. They're equivalent to beef. Some have a flavor that's close to fish, but there are no bones. Other than milk which can be drunk directly, the rest must be cooked through steaming, boiling, frying, and roasting. Otherwise, the mushrooms will absorb your flesh and blood while inside your body, regaining their vitality, turning a person into countless mushrooms. Audrey, Alger, and the other members of the Tarot Club originally listened on with interest as though it was an exciting story, but as they listened in, they subconsciously shrank back, becoming unusually silent. Only the hermit Katlia's eyelids twitched. She decided to have a good talk with Frank when she returned to the real world. She was very worried that, one day, when the Star Pirates were to hold a vote, a large number of mushrooms would be amongst those casting that sacred vote. At this moment, after listening attentively, Derek couldn't hide his anticipation and curiosity. "Mr. World, what is flour? Is it like black-faced grass powder? Also, what is milk, what is beef, what is fish?" In fact, he had seen fish before, but he didn't think that they were fish. In a swamp in the southwest region of the City of Silver, there were quite a number of strange fish-shaped monsters that contained venom. They had boils all over their bodies, while others had teeth growing out of spots where their eyes were. Some of their heads had split open, revealing a white membrane layer that could be used to hunt other creatures. No matter how strange those mushrooms are, to the City of Silver, they're all good things that are worth looking forward to. The first thing they need to solve is to be in possession of something, rather than whether it's good or not. When the fool Klein heard that, he cast the world's gaze toward Justice Audrey. Giving detailed descriptions of flour, milk, beef, and fish didn't match the world Gehrman Sparrow's persona. As a senior spectator and Gehrman Sparrow's psychiatrist, Justice instantly understood what he meant. She deliberated for a moment before saying, "The milk is the liquid that cows use to rear its young." She believed that little son could understand this easily. After all, the City of Silver had pregnant women and babies. Seeing the son nod in acknowledgement, she continued, "Milk can provide you with a lot of nutrition and help you grow taller and stronger." Audrey didn't finish her sentence because little son, who was sitting in his seat, was very muscular. After Miss Justice finished explaining the concepts, the son Derek looked eagerly at the world Gehrman Sparrow. "Thank you, Mr. World. This is exactly what our City of Silver needs. When I return, I'll immediately inform the chief. He'll definitely be very happy. What would you like in exchange?" The fool Klein hesitated for a moment before controlling the world Gehrman Sparrow. "The formula for classical metallurgist." "No." Katlia subconsciously tried to stop him, but she ultimately held back her urge. She secretly looked at Mr. Fool, and seeing that the great existence was silent, she immediately felt a lot more at ease. "All right." Derek happily agreed. After the exchange, Leonard applied to have a private conversation with Emlyn. The moment the other members of the Tarot Club were screened from them, Emlyn asked, "When are you letting me out?" Leonard maintained his posture and said, "This isn't something I can decide on. My suggestion is to get someone to contact the upper echelons of the Sanguine as soon as possible and get them to think of a way to get you out. These two fellows created such an accident with the simple term, protective custody." The fool Klein, who was listening by the side, felt the urge to laugh, but he held back. Emlyn's expression darkened. After a few seconds, he said, "Will it be useful finding the upper echelons of the Sanguine? The goddess is the Lady of Crimson. She still cares a lot about you guys from the Moon Domain. Although you do not believe in her," Leonard said perfunctorily. The real explanation in his heart was that an ancient race like the Sanguine, who had lived for several years, definitely had some connections with the various churches, especially when the Sanguine Queen was still the Night Emperor's queen. At that time, the Church of Eve Might had supported the Night Emperor. Emlyn also thought of this and nodded slightly. "I'll try to entrust this to Mr. World." This was the most reliable person he could think of. Just as he said that, Emlyn and Leonard suddenly spoke at the same time. "That won't work." "You also realized it?" The moon. Emlyn immediately glanced at the star beside him. Leonard scoffed. "It's such a simple problem." Emlyn returned with a scoff. "But you just suggested that I contact the upper echelons of the Sanguine. I've been locked up in the Church of Evernight for days. They must have known about it long ago. They probably didn't attempt to rescue me because they're observing, wanting to know who would rescue me, thus, finding my partners." Leonard looked elsewhere. "That's probably the case. So, you can only continue staying behind Cheney's gate. Perhaps in a few more days, they'll lose their patience and get you out." Emlyn didn't know what expression to show. After a private exchange between the human and Sanguine, the World Gehrman Sparrow looked at Furs and said, "Give me the venue and time for the meeting. After the gathering, I'll look for you and bring you to a new place." "All right." Furs hurriedly applied to Mr. Fool and conjured a parchment. While handing it over, she hesitated for a moment before asking, "Mr. World, what needs to be taken note of this time?" "Keep warm," the World Gehrman Sparrow simply replied. "Keep warm." Furs was momentarily stunned, unsure of what he was trying to get at. After looking at the parchment, the World Gehrman Sparrow surveyed the area and said, "Everyone in Backland, please pay close attention to your surroundings for anything abnormal. Firstly, it was very likely that Zeradal would fish out Amon. Secondly, Demonis Trissi might be able to help Mr. Dor prepare a ritual. Thirdly, George III might take the final step to becoming the Black Emperor at some point in time." "All right." Audrey and the other members of the Tarot Club who were in Backland nodded one after another. They recalled the recent situation and didn't find anything out of the ordinary. After another exchange, the other members requested Miss Justice to use hypnosis to help them forget a portion of their memories. After this gathering ended, one figure after another vanished above the grey fog, leaving only the Fool Klein. After sitting in silence for more than 10 minutes, he thought of other questions before returning to the real world. He teleported to the agreed-upon location and waited for Miss Magician to meet him. It was almost winter, and the sky had turned dark at 4 in the afternoon. Under the heavy black clouds, the street lamps hadn't been lit, as coal and gas resources were controlled due to the war. Chapter 1132 Interlude. In the alley where few people visited, the environment grew darker as a cold wind wafted through it. Although it wasn't like a blade that could slice a person's face with its coldness, it seemed to possess magic as it slowly but firmly seeped into the clothes of people. As Gehrman Sparrow, Klein raised his hand and pressed down on his top hat. He saw Miss Magician wearing a dark, colored scarf and a thick coat. She carried a rather heavy suitcase and walked into the alley, looking extremely wary. In the Lone Kingdom, due to the Church of Evernight's influence, many of the clothes that were deemed only male also had lady versions of them. Just like in Intis, the ladies of high society often sat sideways while on horseback, thanks to a special saddle. However, Lone didn't do the same. The ladies had their own horseback attire. Klein pulled out his left hand that was wearing creeping hunger from his pocket and spread open his fingers. "Do you have a stockpile prepared?" Furs suddenly felt a cold wind blow down her neck as she subconsciously shrank back. "Enough for at least 2 weeks of being serialized. I've already handed it over to the editor of the newspaper." Without waiting for Gehrman Sparrow to ask further, she hurriedly added, "I brought a fountain pen, ink, and paper." Klein nodded slightly, took 2 steps forward, and reached out to grab Miss Magician's shoulder. Furs immediately focused as an illusory book appeared in her eyes as it slowly flipped through. Her surroundings immediately became dark and colorful, the reds were redder, the blacks were blacker, and the browns were browner, as they overlapped each other, making her feel like she was in a trance. Furs was already used to this state and had successfully recorded during this traveling process. She also carefully observed the scenery of her trip, as well as the strange and indescribable spirit world creatures that branded themselves in her mind. After a few breaths, her vision went black, and she felt a cold she had never experienced before. Her body couldn't help but tremble. Furs instinctively used a magic trick to illuminate her surroundings. Looking around, she realized that she was in a wooden hut. The World Gehrman Sparrow had already vanished. "Where Ami?" Furs looked at the window and saw that there was a thick layer covering it, preventing any light from shining inside. This made her even more puzzled. She came to the door, stretched out her right hand, and pulled the door behind her. With a creaking sound, she saw the snow blocking the exit. Furs was stunned as Gehrman Sparrow's warning echoed in her mind, "Keep warm." In just 1 or 2 minutes, Klein had already circled the sea once. He used his prey that he had long selected to placate creeping hunger, and he returned to his rental apartment in Backland, awaiting Queen Mystic and Miss Sharon to gather information about any anomalies. In fact, with Klein's style, he would have personally taken action in this area and conducted an additional investigation at the same time. He wanted to ensure that Demonis Trissy had no plans to help Mr. Dor escape, but considering that Zeradol was already in Backland, he decided to be cautious and give up the idea of loitering around. Under the influence of the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics, he felt that if he were to wander around Backland, it was only a matter of time before he ran into Zeradol or even Amon. Sigh, I'd already thought of how to disguise myself. Buying a bicycle, getting a uniform, and riding it across different streets as a postman. This is the easiest way to avoid suspicion. After taking a sip of gurney sap he brought back from the sea, he leaned back into his chair and allowed his marionette, Anuni and Konas, to individually massage his shoulders and legs. The Forsaken Land of the Gods, in the afternoon town camp. After Derek Berg opened his eyes, he immediately stood up, opened the door, and walked around the bonfire to the chief's room. Suppressing his excitement, he took a deep breath and raised his hand to lightly knock on the thick wooden door. "Please come in." Amidst the sounds of knocking, Colin Iliad's deep voice sounded. Derek turned the doorknob and pushed open the door. As he looked at Demon Hunter Colin, whose hair was white and had old scars on his face, he blurted out, "Your Excellency, I found some strange mushrooms. They can be eaten." Colin Iliad fell silent for a moment before slowly asking, "Mushrooms?" Hearing the puzzlement in the chief's words, Derek instantly recalled a mushroom he had seen before. It came from the abandoned temple of the fallen creator. It looked especially bright and appetizing, but it was essentially extremely dangerous. His mood instantly calmed down. He nodded and said, "Yes, mushrooms, different breeds of mushrooms. They can devour the flesh and blood of monsters to grow." Derek described the unique traits of the mushrooms in detail, and he explained what milk, beef, fish, and flour were. In the end, he emphasized that the mushrooms had to be fully cooked before they could be eaten. He also had to take note of the species which were rich in poison. Colin Iliad listened quietly without showing any change in emotions. After some thought, he said, "What other dangers do they have? Or should I say, points that require taking note of?" Derek's face suddenly flushed red. "I'll study it again." Without waiting for the chief to speak, he turned around, opened the door, and ran out. Returning to his room, he took a deep breath and sat down. He began to pray to Mr. Fool, asking him to forward the questions to Mr. World. Above the grey fog, Klein sat on the high-back chair belonging to the Fool. He tapped the armrest with his index finger and silently muttered, "What other dangers are there?" Although Frank's imagination, actions, and creativity make me a little fearful, he's still a Sequence 5 druid after all. No matter how dangerous the mushrooms are, how dangerous can they be? With the years of experience the City of Silver has experienced in the dark environment, it's easy to deal with those mushrooms. In the ruins of the Battle of Gods, the futures producing of milk, the pirate's head growing a watermelon, and other shocking phenomena were due to the remnant aura and divine power of Earth Mother in that area. The real murderer was a deity rather than Frank. Man, if the formation of the Forsaken Land of the Gods happened due to the betrayal of the ancient sun god, the things left behind in that intense battle are definitely not limited to the powers of Evernight, Concealment, Degeneration, and Storm. Perhaps there are some areas that have the influence of the sun and the earth. After some thought, he conjured the world Gehrman Sparrow and made him tell the truth. If they encounter divine powers of the earth domain, those mushrooms might experience an unknown mutation. After receiving a response, Derek rushed out of his room and ran to the chief's door. This time, the door opened without him knocking. Derek turned back to look at his teammates by the bonfire. He entered the room and casually closed the heavy wooden door. The divine power of the earth domain might cause the mushrooms to undergo an unknown mutation. he said frankly without explaining how he had figured that out. Demon Hunter Colin's expression remained unchanged as he repeated the key phrase softly, the divine power of the Earth domain. He lowered his voice and finally fell silent. 10 seconds later, he said, after we return, we can set up a region to plant them to see the effects. Then, what's the price? Derek immediately replied, the formula for classical metallurgist. Colin Iliad nodded slowly. This has to be decided by the 6-member council. When we return to the city, I will push for this matter as soon as possible. Their expedition team would be returning to the City of Silver in the next 2 days. Firstly, after the exploration, the few who survived, as well as those who had lost their loved ones, needed time to adjust their mental states. Secondly, there was a limited amount of food left in the camp, and there was no way to plant any black-faced grass around Afternoon Town. They could only rely on hunting monsters to replenish themselves. Therefore, one of the responsibilities of the expedition team was to deliver safe food. Switching out teams would happen at fixed intervals. Yes, Your Excellency. Derek didn't rush him. He had long gotten used to this process. After he left the room, Colin Iliad came to the window and looked at the bonfire in the middle of the camp. That flame burned quietly. In the deep darkness, the faint yellow light scattered across the entire camp. Roasting over the fire was a disgusting vampire covered in pus. A few days later, Klein separately received the corresponding feedback from Queen Mystic Bernadette, the numinous sect's Patrick Bryan, and Miss Sharon. He confirmed that there were no anomalies regarding material or personnel flow in Backland recently. From the looks of it, Demonis Trissy only wishes to speak to Mr. Dorr for the time being. Furthermore, this seems to be the first time they will establish a connection. Regardless, I still need to give a warning beforehand. This requires finesse. The more I say, the more likely a mistake will be made. Furthermore, I cannot reveal my trump card. After some thought, he found the hair of the deceased that Miss Magician had provided. He unfolded the piece of paper and wrote, "This is what you need. It's a lock of hair from a descendant of the Abraham family. The person who provided it has a request, that is to help ask the existence one question, the problem regarding how they get rid of the curse. Finally, let me remind you to be careful of Mr. Dorr." Klein folded the letter and tucked the lock of hair into it. He took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew on it. After a brief silence, Rionette Tynker walked out of the void with 4 beautiful heads in hand. "Give this letter to the seduced idiot," he instructed as he handed over the letter. Just as he said that, his heart skipped a beat, and he hurriedly added another question, "Can you locate him?" "Yes," one of the heads of Rionette Tynker answered the question before biting the letter. Klein narrowed his eyes. Chapter 1133 Chan in the Backland Bridge area. According to the information provided by Miss Messenger, he found the man who had been seduced by Trissy and ended up helping her send the letter. However, Klein didn't enter the apartment, nor did he disturb his target. He stuck both hands into his black trench coat pocket and continued walking forward. Under the illumination of the street lamps, he walked all the way to the crossroads and turned into another street. During this process, a rat that was stealing food in a particular building suddenly shivered. It then gave up on the piece of cheese and followed the usual tunnel that it used to pass through, and it moved towards the target area. Then, the rat opened its mouth and let out a human's voice, "Blessed of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rörsted archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvetua." The moment the rat finished its sentence, Klein, who had already turned into another street, vanished. There was only a spark left on the spot that quickly dissipated. He had used Flaming Jump, but he wasn't using it to travel. Instead, he had entered a hotel room that he had booked to rendezvous with one of his marionettes, so he didn't need to worry too much about being sensed by Zeradal and meet with an accident. After all, the destination was clear, the journey was short, and there was protection. In the room, with Anuni watching, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived above the grey fog. As he sat at the end of the long bronze table, he held the sea god scepter. With the help of the prayer light, he observed the target through his true vision, the man who helped demoness Trissy relay the news. A few minutes later, Rionette Tinker appeared in the apartment as promised. She took the gold coin and left the envelope on the table. The man trembled in fear again, but in the end, he overcame his own fear. He picked up the letter and weighed it. 15 minutes later, he carefully took out the black sticky paste, separated a small blob, and applied it on the surface of a mirror. Soon, he saw the young girl who had occupied all of his dreams in the dark mirror and hurriedly said, "That crazy adventurer just sent a letter. It seems to contain something else. I didn't open it as per your instructions." At that moment, above the grey fog, the scene Klein saw began to show a strange phenomenon. In his vision, the mirror's condition had already turned blurry. It was closer to being a dark and illusory passageway that didn't look realistic enough. It was connected to something similar in the surrounding area, forming a complicated and abstract spider web that was interwoven into a profound and strange world. Through the grey fog's true vision, he could barely make out the general situation, but he was unable to make out the details. He didn't know what strange and terrifying creatures hid within that world. In mysticism, mirrors are often given the symbolic meaning of leading to another kingdom, and are mostly related to terrifying horrors. Is this the mirror world? My Beyonder powers are completely unrelated to this domain. That's not true. If someone prays to me and attempts magic mirror divination, then there will naturally be an illusory passageway that points towards me, towards the grey fog. Strictly speaking, the mirror world isn't a real world. It's closer to the collective manifestation of doors. By connecting to different mirrors and different mysterious kingdoms, if one becomes lost in there, they might directly appear in the abyss, or even the cosmos. Of course, demigods with this ability should be able to create a reflection world and hide inside. The collective manifestation of doors. High-sequence Beyonders of the Demoness, Wraith, and Apprentice pathways also have similar powers. Does the secret in Secret Sorcerer represent the mirror world to some extent? This is sufficiently mysterious and secretive. Under normal circumstances, even through true vision, there's no way to directly see the mirror world unless someone triggers it. Klein nodded in thought as he heard Demoness Trissy's melodic voice reply, "Throw the letter into the mirror." Can it be thrown in? As a low-sequence Beyonder, the man had never seen such a miraculous thing before. After some hesitation, he held the letter and pressed it against the mirror. On the surface of the mirror, the darkness suddenly spread out like ripples of aqueous light. The man felt his firm touch lighten, and he saw the letter magically pass through the glass surface and enter the illusionary, swirling interior. Right on the heels of that, the letter seemed to be attracted by a huge whirlpool as it continued to sink deeper into the room where Trissy was. Above the grey fog, Klein raised the sea god scepter high and focused on tracking the letter, attempting to lock onto the location of the demoness. At this moment, in his true vision, the dark and deep mirror world began to quake violently, turning everything into a blur. By the time the quaking calmed down, Klein had already lost traces of the letter and demoness Trissy. The aura of the primordial demon girl can even interfere with observations like this. After a moment of silence, Klein let out a sigh. It was precisely because of the various peculiarities related to Trissy that he didn't take the risk to mix his hair into the materials to locate her. It was easy for him to suffer from a terrible hex. He might even die on the spot. To Klein, death didn't really matter. After all, as long as his corpse wasn't pulverized, it was likely the case that he could be revived. But that would mean that he couldn't seize the opportunity to lock onto Trissy. She would definitely change locations quickly. Wouldn't that be equivalent to wasting a precious chance to revive? After suffering the setback, Klein quickly returned to the real world and left the Backlund Bridge area. The next morning, with an ordinary face, Klein rode a carriage to St. Samuel Cathedral. He planned on chanting the honorific name of the Evernight goddess to inform her of Demonis Trisi. When the time came, if an accident were to happen on the night of the full moon, there would at least be a deity watching over Backlund, and would also be prepared ahead of time. Back then, the Evernight goddess was one of the ones who had exiled and sealed Mr. Door. She definitely knew the other party's tricks very well. In such aspects, Klein had never put on a strong front. He had a very clear understanding of himself. Since he couldn't solve the problem himself, he would find someone who could solve the problem to help out. As for why he wasn't doing this at home and had to go to St. Samuel Cathedral, it was because he wanted to observe the situation in the areas around Backlund Street and search for any tiny traces that spelled Amon's arrival. Hazel and her family had once been involved with Amon, and she herself belonged to the Marauder pathway. Be it her fate or the convergence of characteristics, she was among the high-risk group of people who could meet Amon by chance. With regards to this, Klein didn't dare to be too careless or negligent. He reminded himself, and he made arrangements to do a self-examination every once in a while. Similarly, due to Miss Justice's follow-up treatment of Hazel's psychological trauma, anything that happened to Hazel could easily lead to her. Therefore, Klein was also very worried about the safety of this noble lady. He believed that it was necessary to check her condition through the Crimson Star from time to time. Of course, he would avoid relatively awkward periods of time. As his thoughts raced, Klein, who was already close to Phelps Street, got off the carriage in advance. He allowed his marionette, Anuni, to secretly recite the honorific name of Sea God. He and his marionette, Konas, switched positions. In a sealed space that he had distorted, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the grey fog. Then, with the help of the Sea God scepter to widen his true vision, he carefully observed the situation in Backlund Street and the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. Hazel isn't parasitized. Neither is Miss Justice. Same for their maidservants, pets, and bodyguards. The residents and staff of the Charity Bursary Foundation don't show signs either. There are no traces of any Amon-related activity in the various streets in the area. Klein heaved a sigh of relief and returned to the real world. Following that, he approached St. Samuel Cathedral and passed through the door, finding a seat in the dark and quiet prayer hall. After chanting the honorific name of the Evernight goddess in a low voice, Klein described simply, Demonis Trisi has obtained the hair of an Abraham family descendant. She plans to contact a hidden existence on the night of the full moon. I cannot be sure of her exact purpose. After sitting quietly for a while and seeing that the goddess didn't respond, nor did the archbishop appear, Klein wore his silk top hat and slowly walked out of the cathedral. At night, he switched positions and controlled a rat as a marionette as recited another honorific name, the great god of war, the symbol of iron and blood, the ruler of chaos and strife. I wish to meet you. Just like before, the rat lost its life the moment it finished praying. Following that, Klein pulled away from the area. He wanted to meet the Red Angel and talk about Mr. Door and Dark Angel Sasrer. After waiting for a few minutes, with the help of another rat marionette, he saw that the other rat burst into flames, emitting a burning white flame. The flame quickly formed a short line on the ground. I don't want to see you. The muscles on Klein's face twitched indiscernibly. After some thought, he gave up and left the area. After a few seconds, the remaining burning white flames formed a new sentence, "Come on, beg me." By then, Klein had already left. In a house somewhere in Backlund, a pale-faced Sauron Einhorn Medici stood up from the sofa in a black, red-lined robe. He frowned and muttered to himself, "Who's disturbing me?" In the blink of an eye, a full moon had dawned its light on Backlund. In a room illuminated by the crimson light, Demonis Trisi stood at an altar. Around her were ritual materials, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, diamonds, pearls, and lazurite. After some complicated preparations, she lit the hair in her hand and placed it into a cauldron. When the fire was tainted with a layer of darkness, Trissy took 2 steps back and solemnly chanted in Jotun, "Great door of all doors, guide of the endless cosmos, key to all mysterious worlds." Chapter 1134 Mr. Door. As Trissy recited the words, the gems around her emitted cracking sounds as they shattered into powder and floated up. They shimmered with red, blue, green, or resplendent light before rapidly gathering into a torrent that surged towards the candlelight on the altar. At the same time, strands of hair that had been burnt inside the cauldron joined the process. The fire began to expand and interweave with each other, turning increasingly dark, as if it was an illusory door that led to other worlds. Trissy immediately felt the surrounding temperature drop rapidly, as though countless dangers were seeping out of the fire. A sentence flashed across her mind. It was a reminder from Gehrman Sparrow, "Be careful of Mr. Door." As expected of someone with a messenger of that level. His understanding of Mr. Door, and his confidence in knowing about my plans, might be deeper and more precise than I imagined. Trissy slowly took a deep breath and patiently waited for the subsequent changes. In just a blink of an eye, she felt that the void in the room thinned significantly. Many of the places were covered with shadows, as though there were large amounts of indescribable creatures hiding behind them. The dim, expanding flame slowly turned into a gigantic, deep crimson vortex. As the vortex spun, an ethereal voice that could pierce through one's spirit body finally sounded from the bottom, "Cheek?" Upon hearing this voice, the blood vessels in Trissy's forehead throbbed. It was as if her head had been pierced by countless steel needles as they crazily stabbed and twisted. Her black hair flared up despite the lack of wind. Every strand grew slightly thicker, and the skin on her face became transparent. Her blood vessels protruded out one after another, densely packed like a spider's web. After spending a great deal of effort, Trissy finally managed to control herself. She then heard the voice that could make most Beyonders lose control, chuckling and saying, "It looks like its cheeks blessed." Back then, we had seen the second blasphemy slate together, and we were able to surpass sequence 1, and live to this day. Now, the only ones left are likely the artisan, Cheek, and me. Trissy ignored Mr. Door's poignant sigh and said with a twisted expression, "Honorable Mr. Door, I have something to ask you." "Speak." "The time spent being lost and trapped in the darkness and the storm is just too boring. It's rare for someone to have a chat with me," the terrifying voice replied without much change from the slowly rotating dark vortex. Trissy's facial muscles twitched involuntarily, still unable to get used to the ravings of this evil god's equal. She paused for a few seconds before saying, "I want to know if there are any unorthodox ways to enter the 9 secret mausoleums built by Blood Emperor Tudor for becoming the Black Emperor." It was unknown where he was, but Mr. Door's ethereal laughter sounded through the endless void, "So it's because of this. This isn't difficult. I'll give you a symbol. You can gather the blood of Beyonders from different pathways and mix them together. Mixing it with your spirituality, draw the symbol in front of the mausoleum. Then, you can open the secret passage that leads into it." As the existence spoke, sparks separated from the dark vortex, forming a rather complicated symbol in midair. It was like doors that were stacked in decreasing sizes as they randomly extended without end. Trissy held back the excruciating pain of her spirit body tearing apart. She memorized the symbol and sought confirmation. There must be blood from all 22 Beyonder pathways. Each pathway only requires the blood of a Beyonder, regardless of his sequence. How much blood of each pathway is required? Mr. Door replied in the same way that he had been raving in earlier, "Right, there's no need for too much. Just a small tube will do. Just guarantee that the symbol drawing can be finished." Although Trissy wore a painful grimace, she couldn't help but smile when she received the critical information. This, combined with her overall expression, made her appear odd, as though she was a lunatic. After completing her main goal, Trissy asked again to ensure smooth cooperation with Gehrman Sparrow in the future. "The Abraham family wants to know how to get rid of the ancient curse." The dark vortex was silent for a few seconds before sighing. set up such a ritual. Sacrifice one of the demigods of the seer, apprentice, and marauder pathway. Once I leave the storm and penetrate the darkness, the curse will no longer exist. Trissy wasn't interested in how the Abraham family could escape the ancient curse. After receiving the answer, she couldn't take it any longer. As she thanked Mr. Dorr, she began to stop the ritual. As for Mr. Dorr, he didn't attempt to bewitch, threaten, or corrupt her. After the dark fire vortex disintegrated and the ritual ended, Trissy began to cogitate, spending nearly an hour to calm the effects of Mr. Dorr's ravings. After doing all of this, Trissy took out a pen and paper and copied the symbol provided by Mr. Dorr. She described the two answers in detail. She knew that she was being pursued by Saintess of White Katarina, and there seemed to be even more terrifying hunters that would follow her wake. It was very difficult for her to find the blood of beyonders of different pathways that quickly, so she planned on leaving this matter to Gehrman Sparrow. In addition, she believed that even if George III and the others believed that there was no problem with the secret mausoleum and that it was safe enough, thus, not leaving too many guards, there were still precautions inside. It wasn't something that a sequence 4 could quickly force their way through and cause damage. That way, they would be stopped by the reinforcements and lose their best chance. As for Gehrman Sparrow, even his messenger was at the level of an angel. The strength of the organization behind him was obvious, so they had the ability to destroy the mausoleum at the critical moment, causing the Black Emperor ritual to fail. She couldn't complete it herself, so of course she had to find assistance from someone with the ability to accomplish it. After throwing the letter into a mailbox on a nearby street, the black-haired, black-coated Trissy slowly walked down in the cold and lonely road. On the dim road, she looked at the light from the gas lamps and laughed self-deprecatingly. For the sake of a little indignation, I've actually gone this far. You're lucky. At least I'll avenge you. And if I die, apart from those who hate me, no one will remember me. After receiving the letter from Miss Messenger, Klein sat on the chair and read it several times. Before he went above the grey fog to divine the authenticity of Mr. Dorr's method, he subconsciously thought about how quickly he could gather the blood from the 22 Beyonder pathways. This symbol is very similar to the symbol behind Miss Magician's chair. I can use my own for seer. For apprentice, I can find Miss Magician, and also give her some pressure to write. There are 3 choices for the Marauder pathway: transform a marionette into a mosquito and send a mosquito to bite Hazel, obtain it from Vice Admiral Iceberg's third mate named Flowery Bowtie, and lastly, get it from Leonard's grandpa. The Spectator pathway, Miss Justice. The Bard pathway, Little Sun. The Storm pathway, Mr. Hanged Man. The Reader pathway, Vice Admiral Iceberg, or that demigod named Luca. Secret suppliant, get the second mate of Mam Hermit, Bloodless Heath Doyle. The Corpse Collector pathway, Numinous Episcopates Patrick Bryan. The Sleepless pathway, My Dear Poet. The Warrior pathway, most of the citizens of the City of Silver or Father Yatravsky. Planter, Frank. Apothecary, Emlyn. Arbiter, Miss Zio. Lawyer, Marionette Konas. Hunter, Danitz or Anderson. Demoness, get Trissy to provide it herself. Prisoner, Miss Sharon or Marie. Criminal, I temporarily have no targets. Mystery Prior, Mam Hermit. Savant, Frank's experiment assistant. Monster, Marionette Inanel. From the looks of it, most of them can be obtained in a very short period of time. The corresponding channels have sufficient trust in me and believe that I wouldn't curse them with their blood. This Demoness Trissy definitely has a way to eliminate the connection between the blood and the actual body. She won't object. Only Devil. Although I've encountered a few, they have either died or fled. Currently, I have no target in mind. Yes, I can ask Little Sun if the City of Silver has any devil flesh and blood left in its inventory. They will encounter some from time to time. If he hadn't thought about it, Klein wouldn't have realized that, in less than 2 years of his transmigration, he had actually established a deeper connection with most of the Beyonder pathways. He immediately retracted his thoughts and seriously considered Mr. Door's escape ritual. Sacrifice one of each, marauder, apprentice, and seer demigods. These are the three pathways that can be interchanged. Mr. Door wants to temporarily reconcile the three pathways, and use an ingenious method to open the passage to return. The demigods of these three pathways aren't that easy to capture. It's possible for the Abraham family to do so at its peak. After the death of the high-sequence Beyonders in the War of the Four Emperors and the corresponding setbacks, it's pretty much hopeless. If Mr. Door could be more patient and give the descendants more time to grow, it wouldn't be impossible. However, he still constantly cries for help, causing the deaths of promising descendants. Is he crazy? A lunatic who looks like a normal person? After some thought, he burned the letter and went above the grey fog to do 2 divinations. The revelations he received was that the method to enter the secret mausoleum was real. Mr. Door's return ritual was also true. Looking at the spirit pendulum in his hand, he sat silently in the high-back chair for a long time. After a few minutes, he clenched his left hand and gripped the topaz pendant tightly. He muttered to himself, "All there is left is to wait for the Bizarro Sorcerer potion to be completely digested, and for George III to hold the ritual." You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.